Breaking news, nearing a deal. President Trump says an agreement with Iran will be announced shortly.
He would much rather have me and the Department of State solve this problem than the Department of War having to solve this problem. But the problem's going to be solved one way or the other.
Can negotiators get it across the finish line? And will it hold?
Shots fired near the White House.
President Trump has said a deal is close, only for the two sides to remain far apart.
Secret Service says it killed a gunman after he approached a checkpoint and began shooting.
Plus, a pause in a $14 billion arms sale to Taiwan. Are you confident the president will approve that package?
Well, we're waiting.
What it means after President Trump called the deal a negotiating chip with Beijing.
Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend. We're coming to you live from Bloomberg's World Headquarters in New York. I'm David Gura.
I'm Christina Ruffini. We're here with Lisa Mateo. It's Sunday, May 24th. Welcome to our listeners and viewers across all our Bloomberg platforms, radio, TV, streaming, and Bloomberg.com, and of course, the Bloomberg Business app. We've got a lot of news to get to today. Biggest news, of course, is the White House saying a deal with Iran will be announced shortly, but we are short on details this morning, David.
Yeah, the president revealing in a Truth Social post yesterday, he had a big meeting in the Oval Office yesterday. There was a framework discussion that was hashed out with members of his national security team. He reached out to a variety of world leaders, including the Prime Minister of Israel. But as you say, Christina, no word yet on what's in that deal exactly and what the timeline is for him announcing it in full.
Or if we're going to hear from the president today, but we will be here keeping tags on all of it, and keeping tabs on our other headlines this morning is Lisa Mateo.
You got it, and let's start with the shooting outside of the White House. This all comes less than a month after the White House Correspondents' Dinner shooting. Now, the 21-year-old armed suspect, he was known to the Secret Service and under a court order to stay away from the White House. ABC's Allison Kosick has the details.
It happened as ABC News was on the White House grounds, covering another story. Selena Wang was in the middle of a report on the North Lawn when the story suddenly changed.
President Trump has said a deal is close, only for the two sides to remain far apart.
Wang and her crew were taping a story when they heard what sounded like gunshots just steps away. They immediately took cover after hearing people yelling for them to sprint to the White House briefing room.
We have to evacuate shooting. We have to evacuate shooting.
The camera crew telling the network they needed to get inside. Secret Service says it started just after 6 p.m. when a 21-year-old man walked up to a checkpoint near 17th Street and Pennsylvania Avenue, pulled out a weapon and opened fire on officers. Secret Service fired back, striking him. He was taken to a local hospital where he later died. Law enforcement quickly moved to secure the area, setting up barricades near the checkpoint. A bystander was also hit by gunfire. No Secret Service members were injured.
And that was ABC's Allison Kosick reporting. President Trump was inside the White House at the time, and officials say he is fine. Investigators now looking into what led up to that shooting. To the conflict in the Middle East, where President Trump said in a social media post that a peace deal with Iran was nearing completion and that the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz would be announced shortly. Axios reported the pact would involve a 60-day extension of the ceasefire, where the Strait would be reopened and Iran would be allowed to sell its oil. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio says there's been progress made on an outline that could open the Strait without tolls.
And with addressing some of the key things that underpin what has been Iran's nuclear weapons ambitions in the past.
Rubio is in India for a 4-day visit for talks with senior Indian officials on issues ranging from energy to regional security. Today, he spoke with his Indian counterparts. And more to come. David and Christina.
All right, thank you, Lisa. We're going to start with that breaking news. As we mentioned, the U.S. and Iran are reportedly close to signing a deal that would reopen the Strait of Hormuz. The White House says it hopes the differences between those two nations will be resolved in the coming hours and that a deal could be announced as early as today.
Well, President Trump posted that the agreement has been largely negotiated and will be announced shortly. Secretary of State Marco Rubio spoke about it overnight on that trip he's taking to India. He said there's been significant progress.
I think we've made some progress. I'm always cautious when I say that because you can agree to things on paper, they actually have to be implemented. You can agree to things in writing and then you actually have to go out and do it. And but I do think perhaps there is the possibility that over the next few hours the world will get some good news, at least with regards to the Straits and with regards to a process that can ultimately leave us where the president wants us to be, and that is a world that no longer has to be in fear or worry about an Iranian nuclear weapon. And so I do think there's some good news on that front, but not final news on that front.
Neither the U.S. or Iran has released a copy of the reported deal. We don't know what's in it, but Axios cites a U.S. official who says the agreement involves a 60-day ceasefire extension during which the Strait of Hormuz will be open with no tolls, and Iran would agree to clear its mines. In exchange, the U.S. would lift the blockade and allow Iran to sell oil. There'd be negotiations on curbing Iran's nuclear program.
And again, this is based on reports that neither the U.S. nor Iran has confirmed those details. Something missing out of those reports so far, David, is word on Iran's ballistic nuclear program that was able to wreak havoc throughout the region. Not something I've seen mentioned from readouts from either side. But we're going to ask those questions of Bloomberg News White House correspondent Jeff Mason and Bloomberg News Jerusalem reporter Dan Williams. Jeff, we want to start with you. First of all, we tried to give you a Sunday off, but the news cycle had other plans. Do we have any idea how close this is to the finish line? Any word on if we're going to hear from the president today? And how did this come together? Who was actually negotiating this? Because he had this big call with a bunch of Gulf leaders yesterday. It's unclear to me who was really the powerhouse behind this particular attempt at a deal.
So a couple of things. We haven't gotten any updates on the president's schedule. There's always a possibility that he'll speak, but there's also always the possibility that he will just continue to release news over social media, which is what he did yesterday. I also think, you know, you're smart to note that we don't have a lot of details. I think it's also worth noting that the president has suggested that a deal was close before, and then that didn't end up happening. So a note of skepticism there that actually sort of ties in with what Secretary Rubio said, which is that at times they've gotten close on paper, but it hasn't materialized in terms of action. Lastly, just a bunch of open questions about the actual nitty-gritty of what that deal is. What Axios reports that you noted before is interesting in that it sounds like it would go back in many ways to the status quo before the war. The Strait being open, Iran being able to sell its oil, i.e. no blockade, and then tabling and going back to negotiations about its nuclear program. Will that be seen as a victory or a loss politically for President Trump? I think that's something that we'll be watching as we get more details in the coming hours and days.
Dan Williams, I want to get your perspective on all of this. Again, we're kind of piecing together the reporting that we're getting from, yes, Bloomberg, of course, but other organizations, the Wall Street Journal and Axios, offering some detail on what might be in this plan. And I'm struck by what Axios reported, that there would be some resolution here to that Israel-Lebanon conflict. I'm curious if that's being reported in Israeli media, and indeed what the response has been to the prospect of that happening from the Israeli government.
That is the second front to this war, and one that's most pressing for Israelis now, given the daily drumroll of fighting, the mounting death toll on both sides. It's something Israelis would find very hard to tolerate if indeed they would be expected to hold fire there, given the lack of any kind of conclusive achievement against Hezbollah that these Israelis have dramatically expanded their buffer zone in southern Lebanon. What we've had in the last hour is an Israeli official who requested anonymity, saying that in that overnight conversation between the Prime Minister Netanyahu and the US President Trump, the Israelis received an assurance that they would retain what they call freedom of action on all fronts against threats. So the question there would be whether the allies would agree that a threat is a threat that's worth Israel striking, even at the cost of whatever ceasefire emerges from this deal. Also, the Israelis are saying that Trump has assured them that any final deal with Iran would see the removal of all enriched uranium from Iran. Then the question is, if this is a ceasefire, is it a de facto end to the war, or is it another open-ended liminal state of reduced action, increased diplomacy, without anything clearly conclusive? I think the Israelis are worried that this will be kicking a can down the street, the proverbial street, in order to get Gulf partners beyond the Eid al-Adha holiday, which is a few days away, Americans beyond the July 4th holiday, and indeed much of the world beyond the World Cup, the soccer tournament which the United States will be hosting in the coming 6 weeks.
Jeff, to Dan's point, this does seem like, although it's being presented by the president on social media with the aplomb of something that has finality to it, it does seem like another stopgap measure, because one of the big things that seems to be outlying is there is already a disconnect between what U.S. officials are saying and what Iranian officials are saying about enriched uranium. Two U.S. officials told the New York Times that Tehran has agreed to give up its stockpile of highly enriched uranium. But three senior officials also told the Times that deal that's being negotiated says nothing about the fate of Iran's nuclear material, and that's something that will be laid out in a negotiation, a separate negotiation, 60 to 90 days down the road.
Right. So lots of contradictory messaging there and questions. I will tell you just a little bit of color from my last week. On Thursday, the White House had put together a conference call about the Iran war and about a potential, we thought was a potential deal, and then pulled it down at the last minute. And that was sort of interesting and also suggestive of the fact that if they put it on at all, they had something to say. I also was in the Oval Office on that Thursday and asked the president about the Strait of Hormuz and whether or not he would be comfortable with Iran continuing to charge tolls. And he said, no tolls. Is that something that Iran is going to agree to going forward or not? That's also not entirely clear. So lots and lots of open questions, and really the only ones who have those answers are the folks at the top who aren't talking yet.
Right, and apparently now you have the Omanis talking to Iran about a possible tolling system. I asked some Mideast diplomats about that, and they said they are so outraged about what happened with those negotiations in Geneva that they're maybe putting some interest in there to antagonize Washington.
Feels like another era ago with those negotiations. But Jeff, let me ask you how this is playing politically outside of the White House, but around Washington, D.C. And we heard from the former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo on Twitter, writing the deal being floated with Iran seems straight out of the Wendy Sherman, Ben Rhodes playbook. Pay the IRGC to build a WMD program and terrorize the world. Not remotely America first, he continues. It's straightforward. Open the dam strait, deny Iran access to money, take out enough Iranian capability so it cannot threaten our allies in the region. One of just many variations on a theme there. I think we saw a lot of similar tweets from Republican lawmakers as well, who, again, not having all of the facts, not knowing what's in this agreement, are really pushing back strongly on what may have been negotiated in the Oval Office yesterday.
Indeed, and that's been a concern for conservatives and the more right-leaning part of President Trump's base for some time, that he got into this war for what they considered to be the right reasons, then saw a lot of political pressure because of the increase in fuel prices, the unexpectedly long time that this has taken, and the upcoming midterm elections hovering in the background, and now wondering if President Trump is just looking for an exit without actually achieving the objectives that he said he would do when he started the war. Noting, by the way, I would note, by the way, that some of those objectives at the very beginning of the war were unclear. But certainly he has been consistent in saying from the very beginning, and is continuing to say, that he doesn't want Iran to obtain a nuclear weapon. And that's what former Secretary Pompeo is referencing there, and also former Ambassador John Bolton has said may not be achieved with this deal, and may not be anything even as strong as the Obama-era deal that President Trump withdrew the United States from and has been very, very critical of.
Yeah, Dan, I'm wondering how regional allies are feeling about this kind of half measure, because it almost feels like that could be more dangerous. I know Gulf countries are urgently trying to get that strait open. I know they've had a full court press calling the White House. They were on this press call yesterday. Diplomats, I'm told, have been working the phones kind of nonstop to keep the president from restarting strikes on Iran. But where you're left, are people in the region feeling more or less secure if this is this kind of uneasy détente that this is left at for the time being?
I think in the Gulf, given what they discovered in the early days of this war, that Iran was willing to open up a front with them directly at substantial cost, not just in terms of the flight of tourism, the flight of expats, but also blows to the lifeblood energy sector of those countries. I don't think they want to dice with that again. The Iranians made very clear that should there be a resumption of war, and it's worth remembering that in parallel to these talks, we had, at least in Israel, literal reminders every hour or so, major flyovers by the Air Force, presumably US warplanes as well, preparing for that potential resumption, which now appears to be in abeyance, the potential of open warfare with Iran. For the Gulf countries being at Iran's doorstep, that was a pretty fearsome prospect, and it would appear they wanted to stave that off, at least in the coming days, certainly to get past this major Muslim holiday that's only a few days from now. So they will be looking at this. It would appear, I think we can describe this deal as it's emerging from what we've been told as a limited ceasefire around the Strait of Hormuz, which would ease energy transport and exports for everyone, including Iran, which would remove Iran's de facto chokehold from its part from that waterway and leave other issues to be discussed in the coming days and weeks. The big open question is how long U.S. forces will remain in the region. If and when we see Trump drawing them down, we will know that de facto, if not de jure, this really is the end of the war.
Jeff, I want to go back to the latest. Thank you for your attention to this matter post from the president. One line toward the end of it when he says he's had this meeting with all of these Gulf leaders yesterday in the Oval Office. Then he says, separately, I had a call with Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu of Israel, which likewise went very well. I'm curious what color you can give us on the state of the relationship between these two leaders. And as we've been talking about over the course of this conversation, there's a lot of hesitancy, perhaps anger at the way that the U.S. is approaching this stopgap, this resolution to the conflict. How is the stability of that relationship between the president and the prime minister, so much as we know right now?
Well, it's a complicated relationship for sure, and certainly Israel had a hand in talking President Trump into going into this war in the first place. Reporting has shown, although obviously it was President Trump's decision, and he decided to go with it. But he has been occasionally critical of Prime Minister Netanyahu and Israel's decisions during the course of this war. That said, they do share the same objectives about preventing Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. And I think the question, again, and I'm sorry to keep sort of answering your questions with more questions myself, the question will be, is Israel on board with some of the elements of this deal, including, as you rightly asked of Dan, the aspect of Hezbollah and Lebanon?
Yeah, and actually, Jeff, we're running short on time, so I do want to kick it over to Dan, who wants to answer David's question as well. He just told us. So, Dan, what you got?
I think I would direct you to the Prime Minister's Twitter account a few hours ago. He hasn't commented on the Iran talks. He did remind everyone that Trump is Israel's best friend in the White House, and commenting on that shooting at the White House, I think there's an implicit message there to the Israeli base that Trump is the best deal that Israel can hope to get, that what Trump decides Israel will have to fall in line with, there's simply no one else to turn to, and I think that really shows who calls the shots here.
All right, Dan Williams and Jeff Mason, thank you both so much for joining us this morning. I know we'll have a lot more to talk to you about as the day progresses.
Yes, continue to watch the social feeds to see what emerges, and we'll see if the president comes out.
Exactly, we've got it up on our screens. We'll be ready to read it to you.
Framework of a deal. We'll see what comes of that. All right, Taiwan was top of mind at the President's Summit. Chinese President Xi Jinping, President Trump calling U.S. military support for Taiwan a negotiating trip, which was startling to a lot of folks in Washington. We'll speak with Taiwan's special representative to the United States. That is straight ahead on Bloomberg This Weekend, on Bloomberg Television, Bloomberg Radio, at Bloomberg.com, and on the Bloomberg Business app. Stay with us.
Thank you for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date on today's top stories. Ukrainian authorities say Kyiv came under a massive Russian drone and missile barrage. It comes hours after President Volodymyr Zelensky and the U.S. Embassy warned of an imminent strike. Ukrainian's Air Force says Russia fired 90 missiles and 600 drones. The mayor of Kyiv saying on Telegram that at least 2 people were killed and 44 injured. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth delivered the commencement address to graduating cadets at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point yesterday, telling them that they could soon be called to serve in war.
And now today, we are going to send you. We're sending you to lead. We're sending you to forge warriors. And we're sending you, perhaps, to war. And you are ready.
Hegseth did not specifically mention the war in Iran. He also criticized DEI and what he called woke policies in the military. Evacuation centers remain open in Southern California as authorities work to cool an overheated chemical storage tank and keep it from exploding. California Governor Gavin Newsom has declared a state of emergency in Orange County. Fire Authority Division Chief Craig Covey said that the main concern was that the tank could fail and crack, releasing the chemical onto the ground, or it could explode.
Letting this thing just fail and blow up is unacceptable to us. Our goal is to find something and not allow that happen, not let it damage our community, not let it damage our environment.
The tank is located at GKN Aerospace in Garden Grove, and that's less than a mile from Disneyland's 2 theme parks. No injuries have been reported. And Congo has suspended flights to the eastern city of Bunia due to escalating cross-border risks from Ebola as the outbreak spread across 3 provinces. The U.S. has expanded its Ebola response, announcing enhanced airport screening requirements for travelers arriving from Congo, Uganda, and South Sudan, along with emergency funding, medical supply shipments, and the deployment of disaster response team to affected areas. David and Christina.
Very much. Resonating in my head still is what Jeremy Conondike told us yesterday, that these numbers are staggering, the speed with which those numbers have ticked up, and how very likely it's a massive undercount of how many cases there are.
100%, because there just isn't infrastructure there. And I was also reading this morning that the borders are so amorphous around there. It's really hard to stop the spread because there's nothing to stop people from moving because they do it so frequently.
Continue to track all that. Lisa, thank you very
Thanks,
much.
Lisa.
The U.S. has paused a $14 billion sale of arms to Taiwan just days after President Trump's meeting with President Xi Jinping in China.
This comes as the president said the U.S. is not looking for a country to, quote, go independent.
Should the people of Taiwan feel more or less secure after your meetings with President Xi?
Neutral. Neutral.
Has the policy changed at all?
No, nothing's changed.
U.S. policy?
No, nothing's changed. I will say this. I'm not looking to have somebody go independent and, we're supposed to travel 9,500 miles to fight a war. I'm not looking for that. I want them to cool down. I want China to cool down.
But you're waiting on approving billions of dollars of weapons for Taiwan.
That's right.
Is that moving forward?
Well, I haven't approved it yet. We're going to see what happens.
What are you looking for?
I may do it. I may not do it.
Yeah, what's your hinge point?
We spoke to Taiwan's representative to the U.S. Ambassador Alexander Yu about whether he believes the U.S. would back Taiwan.
First of all, thank you for Christina and David for having me on your program. The U.S. administration has been very emphatic, during and after the trip for President Trump to Beijing, including President Trump himself, mentioned that there is no change in U.S. policy towards Taiwan. And so that's in itself, it's a real reassurance to Taiwan. But at the same time, we are ready to defend ourselves. We're trying to beef up our own defensive capabilities, and the United States has been our primary provider of armed sales to Taiwan, and we hope that to continue to do so in facing this mounting and growing aggression from mainland China.
No doubt you heard the president talk about that $14 billion arms package as a bargaining chip. And I wonder what your reaction to that is, bearing in mind what you just said, that you've gotten votes of confidence from the administration, as you say. What should we make of the president saying it's something that could be deployed as a bargaining chip?
Well, I'll respect President Trump's decision. He also said, and the administration mentioned just yesterday, that a decision will be made by the president anytime soon. We hope that it will be a positive one. But again, the important thing is there's no change in U.S. policy towards Taiwan, and that includes longstanding arms sales to Taiwan, and especially commensurate with the threat level that Taiwan is receiving. And the threat level we're receiving from mainland China right now is very, very high.
I understand that there's no official change in policy, but it does seem that there's a change in energy and the vociferous nature by which previous presidents have defended Taiwan to the Chinese, and the kind of lukewarm defense, if that even was a defense the president delivered in Beijing. Do you feel like he delivered a strong enough message in those meetings with the Chinese leader?
Well, Xi Jinping, from what we know, Xi Jinping mentioned Taiwan a lot during his 2-day trip in Beijing. He wanted to make it the topic of discussion, although there are many, many things that should have been, it was on the table. And he talked about Chinese version of the Taiwan so-called problem. And I stress that Taiwan were not the problem. The problem is mainland China. They're the aggressors. They're the ones ramping all this military pressure on not just Taiwan, but throughout the Indo-Pacific, including Japan, the Philippines, etc. So their ambitions go way beyond Taiwan. They're armed. They're engaging in this very massive military buildup. And it's just not for Taiwan. It's trying to impose their influence not only in the Pacific, but beyond it in the Pacific. So we are well aware of China's intentions to try to swallow Taiwan. Again, we want to stress that Taiwan, the Republic of China, the official name of my country, we are not subject to the Chinese administration or control. The People's Republic of China have never been never controlled Taiwan. So the claim on Taiwan is something that is, it's a bogus claim, but they have this intention, and we'll do whatever it takes to defend it.
Christina mentioned the policy hasn't changed here, but I guess it stands to, there was this moment when the president indicated he might be calling Taiwan's president, having a conversation with Taiwan's president. Curious your reaction to that, what you think we should make of that, and if it does stand to upend a policy that's been in place now for many decades.
Well, we will see. I mean, there's not much I can say at this point, but we'll leave it to the United States to make any announcements. But again, the topic of discussion in Beijing, a lot of was on Taiwan. So I think that at that very high level, and I think that this discussion between U.S. and Taiwan at that level, I think it's reasonable. There's a lot at stake, not just the geopolitical issue that we just talked about, but also about technology. Taiwan is your fourth largest trading partner of the United States. We engaged in $256 billion worth of trade last year. But also, the United States is looking for maintaining its supremacy on artificial intelligence. And as you know, Taiwan manufactures physically in Taiwan 95% of the advanced chips, semiconductors. But also, our companies make 90% of the servers, the stacks, the servers that runs the AI industry. So we've been working with the United States closely on these fields. We just signed an MOU on investment and an agreement on reciprocal trade earlier this year. So there's also a mounting investments coming into the United States. 40% of our FDI is coming to the United States. And also we're working with the United States on other issues such as critical minerals, bringing more Taiwanese investments, manufacturing to the United States, which suits also United States effort for industrialization. So actually there's a lot between Taiwan and U.S. that we can talk about.
I do want to go back to that in a second, but I want to ask you first, you mentioned that the threat from China was increasing. Do you think that is particularly imminent? Do you have a timeline for that? And what evidence do you have to support that?
Well, there's been talk about 2027, the Davidson window, but because Xi Jinping had spoken to their People's Liberation Army some years ago that they should be prepared to invade Taiwan by this year, of 2027. 2027 is the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Liberation Army. So there's sort of a symbolic, objective of aim to making that. But there have been preparing for that, actively. As I mentioned, they're massively having a military buildup, and they are under no threats in their borders, but they have been doing so. So their military capability has been enhanced, and they are getting more and more aggressive. Actually, right after President Trump's visit to Beijing and President Putin's visit, now they're amassing over 100 ships along the Taiwan Straits and nearby in the area, sort of again trying to impose this coercion, military coercions against Taiwan, but other neighbors as well. So that's part of their nature. Again, they keep so-called drawing red lines, but they keep moving the goalposts to their advantage to say, if you cross the red line, I'm going to react. But they keep moving the goalposts, and that's making things very difficult. I want to stress that, U.S. and Taiwan, we're like-minded countries, and we have to work together, along with other neighbors in the area, to face this mounting aggression on mainland China. Again, we're friends. If you travel to Taiwan, you don't need a burner phone. You don't need to ditch out all the things that they received in the country at a trash bin before you board a plane. We're value-wise like-minded.
I want to ask you lastly just about the state of the relationship and the U.S.'s posture towards friends, multilateral institutions, and going back to the clip that we played at the top of Bret Baier asking President Trump about the relationship. There was a lot of ambiguity in the president's response. And I'm curious, in light of the way this president pursues foreign policy, if there are more open questions than there have been in the past, and how that makes the situation more difficult, not knowing what the president's going to do, not having the kind of unequivocal statements that you might have gotten from presidents in the past.
Well, I mean, I think every president has his own specific style of conducting, business and statesmanship. But I want to stress this administration, as well as others, they've been affirming that there's no change in the position of the United States policy towards Taiwan. And actually, President Trump, during his first term and this current term, actually, he has sold more arms to Taiwan than any other president. During his first term, he sold Taiwan $18 billion worth of weapons. And in this term so far, it's been over $11 billion. So
are you confident that next package will come through? Are you confident the president will approve that package?
Well, we're waiting, as most people are waiting for the announcement. But we hope and we are sure that having Taiwan strong in defense suits not only Taiwan's own interest in defending better itself, but also United States interest to have peace and stability in the area. Again, nobody wants a war. United States coast is 9,500 miles away, but Guam is only 1,700 miles away from Taiwan. So again, any conflict in Taiwan will be devastating. It's not only for Taiwan, but also for world trade. 50% of world trade goes through the Taiwan Strait, and any conflict in the area will cause unsurmountable losses. Any losses has been estimated goes into the trillions.
All right, Ambassador Alexander Yu, Taiwan's representative to the United States. Thank you, sir, so much for joining us.
Thank you.
No, thank you for having me on your program.
Welcome back to Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Christina Ruffini here with David Gura. Medical facilities in the Democratic Republic of Congo are feeling the strain as Ebola makes its way through parts of the country. At a hospital in the northeastern part there, doctors describe a sense of dread spreading almost as quickly as Ebola itself.
In the mining town at the center of this epidemic, Bloomberg reports bats the size of chickens swarm abandoned tunnels and may be spreading the virus. Janice Q is one of our colleagues covering the outbreak, and she joins us now from Johannesburg. Janice, great to have you with us, and I wonder if you could just get us up to speed first. We had a couple of conversations yesterday with Jason Gale and Jeremy Conondike, former U.S. official who handled the Ebola outbreak in 2014 for the U.S., just about the prospect of there being a massive undercount here and the difficulty of piecing together sort of how widespread this outbreak is thus far. What does your latest reporting tell you just about how widely this is spread through the DRC and neighboring countries?
We've certainly seen quite a lot of spread within the Congo itself. The probable cases at this stage are sitting at about 867 with just over 200 deaths. But that is undoubtedly an undercount. It is very difficult for health workers on the ground to really do contact tracing. The estimate at this stage is that it's about a fifth of contacts that are being traced. And already Africa CDC's Director General Cassia yesterday was saying that on a like-for-like basis, this particular outbreak is already the second largest after the 2014 to 2016 epidemic in West Africa. And that epidemic was large. It was a lot of people. There were more than 28,000 people infected in that epidemic.
You also, in your piece, you say you've reported the WHO believes this outbreak likely started months ago. Why didn't they catch it sooner, and are they trying to recover from that effort? Is there anything that health officials can do to try to catch these things earlier?
There are a lot of factors in a region like this. The Congo is a really large country in the middle of Africa. The geography is difficult, and then there are also armed forces, specifically in the east, where the epicenter of this has been. There's also been all the funding cuts that we've spoken about before, and we know well of, particularly USAID, which has weakened surveillance in that area. And then there's also the fact that this is a very rare strain. The Bundibugyo strain is not the strain that was in that West Africa epidemic. It's not the one that's been studied, and it's also not the one that has any vaccines or therapeutics approved. And so even on the diagnostics, on the testing, the original tests were really showing negative because it was testing for the Zaire strain instead of the Bundibugyo strain.
Janice, talk a bit about funding and the funding needs as this outbreak widens. You and Jason Gale, with whom we spoke yesterday, write about a request for $319 million. And I wonder if you can put that in a wider context. Bloomberg had reporting earlier last week just about how small the U.S. investment is in Ebola surveillance and mitigation since the cuts that we've seen to USAID here. So put that $319 million figure in context, if you would. Is it likely to be sufficient? Is it likely to come through?
There is quite a lot being promised, but whether it really comes through is yet to be seen. The Africa CDC had a briefing yesterday evening, and they were saying that they really are trying to work as one voice. They had the health ministers from 3 different countries there. So it was Congo, let me just check this, South Sudan and Uganda. Those health ministers were all there. And they also had the WHO and Africa CDC. And they are definitely focusing on coordinating a cross-border response. Of that amount that you mentioned, the $319 million, about 84% is set aside for Congo and Uganda, and then the rest for high-risk neighboring countries. It is to deal with some of the immediate needs, which range to things as basic as personal protective equipment for health workers, etc., on the ground, but also for building longer-term facilities that can be used during outbreaks like this.
I also want to ask what mitigation matters are being done. I was reading this morning that for the first time, DRC itself has suspended flights from the eastern part of the country. Usually that's something airlines do on their own, or other governments. They're taking that precautionary step. What are they trying to do to stop this outbreak? Because I know resources are tight. In your piece, you say hospitals in Northeast Congo don't have proper isolation rooms. One is running low on supplies and staff, as the staff members are now falling ill. This isn't the first time this country has dealt with an Ebola outbreak. So why are they struggling to keep up with this one?
I think the funding cuts, again, have definitely played a part. And then, as I said, they didn't detect which strain it was very early. And so it probably was going undetected for a long period of time. Then on top of that, we've got the fact that they're really having to lean now because they don't have the tools, they don't have the vaccines or therapeutics for this particular strain. They're having to lean a lot on community messaging. And that is quite a tough sell. You often need people on the ground that are trusted to really convey that message. And habits can take quite a while to change. The DG of Africa CDC was speaking about dignified burials. And so one of the things with Ebola is that the mortal remains really can't be touched. The virus can continue to spread if you handle a body. And so trying to be sensitive to customs of the region, but still make sure that there is a safe burial. So a dignified but safe burial. That is one of the messages that they are trying to get across.
Jess, let me just ask you lastly about the parallel that we've been drawing to 2014 and 2016, bearing in mind, as you've pointed out, this is a different strain than we were seeing back then. What can that outbreak tell us, or how does that inform the response that we should see or that we are seeing in DRC now? Does it provide any kind of playbook here, or are we really dealing with a circumstance that's not, if entirely different, a different circumstance?
In theory, we should be dealing with a much better circumstance because we do have vaccines and therapeutics. Unfortunately, they're not specific to the strain. And so in some ways, there are lessons that have been learned from the 2014 to 2016 epidemic in terms of how secure the facilities need to be, how contained they need to be, whether they can actually get those facilities up and running quickly is another story. I do think, though, that we are seeing a sense of urgency across various agencies, various countries. And so support is being flown in. We heard yesterday that during the course of the day, India had promised to send several tons of equipment in. And so I do think that that sense of urgency and speed is definitely different this time around.
All right, Janice Q joining us from our bureau in Johannesburg. She is Bloomberg News health and consumer reporter. Thank you so much.
Appreciate the time. What she said about community messaging, I think, is something you brought up yesterday in the conversations that we were having, the difficulty of doing that, and really the diplomacy that has to take place surrounding outbreaks.
You've got to have trust,
like
especially
these.
when you're asking people not to do things that are religiously affiliated or burial rituals are so important to tradition. So.
All right, let's get a check of other headlines this morning from Lisa Mateo. Lisa?
You got it, and we'll start with more information coming in on the death of NASCAR driver Kyle Busch. Now, his family released a statement saying Busch died after severe pneumonia progressed into sepsis. The two-time NASCAR champion, he died on Thursday after passing out in a Chevrolet simulator. He was preparing to race today at the Coca-Cola 600 at Charlotte Motor Speedway. All 39 drivers in the race will wear a black number 8 decal on their car to honor Busch. He was 41. And the course at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway will light the pylon on lap 18 in honor of Busch. The 110th Indianapolis 500 kicks off later this afternoon in Indiana. 33 drivers will be competing over 200 laps in the greatest spectacle in racing. The first round of the 2026 French Open underway at Roland Garros in Paris. Now, Coco Gauff, she's looking to defend her title on the women's side. There's guaranteed to be a new men's champion with Carlos Alcaraz stepping out due to a wrist injury. And that puts Jannik Sinner in the spotlight on the most famous clay courts in the game. In the NHL playoffs, the Carolina Hurricanes, they topped the Montreal Canadiens 3-2. With the series now tied, tonight the Colorado Avalanche, they take on the Vegas Golden Knights. The Golden Knights lead that series 2-0. And in the NBA, the Knicks are on a roll. They beat the Cavaliers 121-108. They lead the series 3-0. Tonight, the Oklahoma City Thunder, they battle the San Antonio Spurs. OKC, it leads the series 2-1. The Knicks, in case you all wanted to know, they play again on Monday.
Did you watch the game?
So I did not. I was in my 10th dream.
Wow.
But
I stayed up till halftime.
did you?
Yeah.
I'm so proud.
Well, thank you so much, everybody.
Are
I
you
just really
okay?
wanted that affirmation. I am okay. It's a great game.
It was an
It's a
excellent-
pleasure to watch this
Good.
team. You've got me excited about them, Lisa.
They are exciting for sure.
I am excited for the
Thank you very much.
Okay. All right. A major announcement on technology from perhaps an unlikely voice. What the Pope, that's right, the Pope, is saying about the risks of AI.
You can explore live streaming news, interviews, all our Bloomberg content at bloomberg.com/videos. Stay with us.
Welcome back to Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Christina Ruffini here with David Gura. It has been just over a year since Pope Leo XIV became the world's first American Pope. He's preached a, quote, revolution of care, and he's preparing to share his thoughts on how he thinks the world's 1.4 billion Catholics should care about technology.
Bloomberg's Flavia Rotundi covers the Vatican for us. She joins us live now from Rome. Flavia, we're talking about the Pope's encyclical here, focused on AI for the uninitiated, the non-Catholics among us.
I am a Catholic, and I didn't know what this is. So.
I'm doing this for all of you. Explain what the encyclical is, why this is so important that he's doing this.
Sure. Good morning to you. Well, the encyclical, it's the most official act, basically, of a pope. It's something that generally includes some of the priorities of a papacy. So in this case, it's particularly interesting the fact that it actually chose this particularly very specific subject. We'll talk about this in a moment. I just want to pointing out, if it's possible, the fact that the Pope will be present at the presentation of the revealing of this encyclical tomorrow at the Vatican. And this is quite a first, because it's probably the first time of a Pope in the modern era, in a modern age, presenting his own encyclical worldwide and to all people in the world. So it's quite a very, I would say, significant fact.
I mean, shout out to producer Patrick Becker who put this on our radar. But what have encyclicals been like in the past, and why do we think he specifically chose AI? Not one to shy away from controversial topics as Pope.
Sure. He already spoke about AI in the past, I would say. Since the very beginning of his pontificate last year, he actually touched this subject many times. Most recently, also in a conference, he kind of underlined the fact that it is really important to try to understand where his technology is going, in order also to form the younger generations, try to use the criticism also, and try to make the most of it, because we don't expect, of course, the contents of this encyclical are still not known specifically. We will know tomorrow, but we don't expect something just like an essay on the artificial intelligence. We expect more something like how we can use this incredible tool, what opportunities, but also what are the risks, and how this is changing our lives, how this is changing the way we work, we relate, what kind of development we can imagine at some point, and of course, what kind of moral issues, what kind of spiritual, social impact this might have.
It's called Magnificent Humanity. Magnifica Humanitas, yes. I believe is the title. My Latin is rusty. We're going to go with that.
It's better than mine.
Flavia, talk a bit more about his engagement, the Pope's engagement with this subject. So I understand that the co-founder of Anthropic, the AI company, is going to be there with the Pope when this happens tomorrow. Again, Christina mentioning that he's not shying away from dealing with a lot of these, yes, controversial topics, but I think important social topics of the age. Talk a bit more, if you would, just about his level of engagement here. In the world of AI, the way that he's approaching it, and how in the first year of his papacy here, he's elevating the importance of this as something that he wants all Catholics to be discussing, debating, and talking about.
Well, let us say yes. I must say that, of course, the discussion of artificial intelligence within the Vatican have been, of course, becoming more frequent, if you want, in the last few years, given the fact that, of course, the development of the AI itself has been, kind of had quite an acceleration. But this is not a first. I would just point out that Pope Francis too, for example, spoke about AI and the risk of AI in 2024 at the G7 in Italy, and also back in 2016. Italian media, were reporting this quite clearly in the last few days. The Vatican started discussions, actually invited it back in 2016, some scientists, some experts, some researchers from the Silicon Valley to the Vatican, and they started what they called Minerva dialogues. So a kind of informal but cyclical discussions on the development of this science, but technology in general, and also the impact, the possible impact, again, on social life, on moral issues. So I must say that is, the Catholic Church has been quite on the front line on this for a while.
Flavia, quickly before I let you go, I do want to ask you if there's any updates on the contentious relationship between the Pope and the White House. Obviously, we had the Vice President saying that the Pope should be careful when he talks about matters of theology. We had the President saying that he's weak on crime. I know Marco Rubio met with the Pope earlier this month to try to smooth things out. We got about 30 seconds here, but did he succeed, and how's that going?
It seems they succeed. I mean, of course, there was a formal statement after that saying that relations were strong, and definitely, I think that everybody more or less stayed on the same principles as before. But the idea that they met and they say that there's going to be and they're going to stay some common ground, I think it was pretty much significant at that point. So yes, I think it definitely helped.
All right, on the eve of the first encyclical, Flavia Rotundi, thank you very much for that update from Rome.
Thanks
covering
so much.
all of that for us. And Christina, it is fascinating just to see the level of engagement from the Pope on this matter on AI, level of kind of engagement in hot button issues prominently, and we'll see what comes of this.
And embracing technology. He's on Twitter. You see the Vatican is being put on digital archives. They are trying to move in a way that is attractive to the next generation as they try to find their place, as we all do.
Noting there will be a role for AI in the Vatican, which is wild to think about in what form that might take.
No AI sermons. That's what I'm expecting
sermons.
to see in the encyclical.
We'll
No AI sermons.
All right. Thank you very much. Coming up here in the next hour, much more on what's coming out of the White House vis-a-vis Iran.
The next hour of Bloomberg This Weekend starts right now.
Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend, live from New York with David Gura, Christina Ruffini, and Lisa Mateo. The latest headlines, key analysis, big interviews and the stories that hit home on your days off.
Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend. It is 8 a.m. in New York. We're coming to you live from Bloomberg's World Headquarters. I'm Christina Ruffini.
And I'm David Gura alongside Lisa Mateo. We are bringing you the latest breaking news, reports, analysis live this morning, every Saturday and Sunday from 7 o'clock to 10 o'clock Wall Street time. And without question, the story that's animating our broadcast this morning is what the president posted on social media yesterday, indicating that there's some framework of a deal, Christina, to end the war in Iran. He said that he'd met with a variety of world leaders, spoken to them by phone, spoke to the Prime Minister of Israel as well. Details still at 8 o'clock in New York, quite scant, however.
We've got all the Truth Socials up. We've got all the Twitters up. We are waiting to get some updates. And yeah, so far, we're not sure if and when we're going to hear from the president today or if that is going to be brought over the line in time for our broadcast. But we are monitoring it with a bunch of team coverage. We've got our reporters all around the world, and we're going to come to that shortly. But first, let's go to Lisa Mateo with the headlines.
All right, let's get to our other top story, and that's a shooting outside the White House. Sources say the 21-year-old man had a prior encounter with authorities near the White House in July 2025 when he was arrested for unlawful entry. Now, he had also been involuntarily held for a mental assessment by authorities weeks earlier after another incident. ABC's Selena Wang was at a taping a story outside of the White House as this all unfolded.
President Trump has said a deal is close, only for the two sides to remain far apart.
All reporters were then told to run to the White House briefing room. It took place just after 6 p.m. local time. Sources tell Bloomberg the man had been pacing along the street for some time before he approached a police checkpoint near 17th Street and Pennsylvania Avenue, pulled a gun from his bag and opened fire. Secret Service fired back, striking him. He was taken to a local hospital where he later died. A bystander was also hit by gunfire. No Secret Service members were injured. President Trump was inside the White House at the time and is okay. Investigators looking into what led up to that shooting. To the conflict in the Middle East, where President Trump said in a social media post that a peace deal with Iran was nearing completion and that the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz would be announced shortly. Axios reported the pact would involve a 60-day extension of the ceasefire, where the Strait would be reopened and Iran would be allowed to sell its oil. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who was in India for a 4-day visit for talks with senior Indian officials, also commented on the developments.
Suffice it to say that some progress has been made, significant progress, although not final progress has been made.
Rubio adding that there is still work to be done. If the plan succeeds, he said it could leave us with just a completely open strait, one without tolls, and would address nuclear concerns. Well, Ukrainian authorities say Kyiv came under a massive Russian drone and missile barrage. It comes hours after President Volodymyr Zelensky and the US Embassy warned of an imminent strike. The mayor of Kyiv saying that on Telegram that at least 2 people were killed, 44 injured. And California Governor Gavin Newsom has declared a state of emergency in Orange County as authorities work to cool an overheated chemical storage tank and keep it from exploding. They say the main concern is that the tank could fail and crack, releasing the chemical onto the ground, or yes, it could explode. The tank is located less than a mile from Disneyland's 2 theme parks. David and Christina will keep you.
This is a wild story.
Yeah, really, we were
confess
texting
to
about
being
this last night.
naive about it till yesterday when I saw it. My wife brought it up, but they've evacuated like 40,000 people.
40,000.
It's really scary. We should all be keeping quite a close eye on that.
Yeah,
I hope they're able to contain that. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you.
All right, as we await the precise details of this proposed Iran peace deal, Iranian officials are telling the New York Times the potential agreement would formally end the fighting in the region and reopen the Strait.
Secretary of State Marco Rubio made it clear earlier today the Strait does not belong to Iran and should be open to everyone.
Okay, this is an international waterway. They don't own it. It's an international waterway, and what they are doing now is basically they are threatening to destroy commercial vessels using an international waterway. That is illegal under any concept of international law that governs us, but it's also if we allowed that to become normal, we would be normalizing an unacceptable status quo and setting a dangerous precedent that could be replicated here in this region and in multiple places around the world.
Secretary of State earlier today in India. Joining us now are Bloomberg's Horizons Middle East and Africa anchor Jemana Secy and Axios Congressional reporter Andrew Solender. And we're piecing together what we know of what's in this framework plan from a variety of media sources, Axios among them. I'm just going to quote here from what Axios has reported about what could be in this deal. That is a Strait of Hormuz being reopened without tolls, the U.S. lifting that Iranian blockade, an end to all fighting, including fighting in Lebanon, Iran being able to sell oil, and there being discussions about Iran's nuclear program happening not now, but in a few weeks, a few months' time. Andrew, I'm going to have you channel your colleague Barak Ravid here in a few minutes. But before we get there, Jemana, let me go to you first. And there was this wonderful line in David Sanger's piece in the New York Times this morning. He said, it's too early to tell what exactly Trump and Iran have agreed to or if they have agreed to much at all. Let's use that as our jumping off point for this conversation. We have been here before, maybe not exactly here, but there's been the prospect of a deal floated before, and we've seen that kind of come crashing down when we haven't seen corroboration on all points from the Iranians.
Yeah, I will say this time does feel a little bit different because of the buy-in from so many countries in the Gulf Arab region. And even the most hawkish social media commentators, and this I'm referring specifically to UAE commentators, are referencing the fact that there is going to be some form of a breakthrough or of a deal as well. And the fact that President Trump, even in that True Social post yesterday, explicitly said that, the final framework needs sign-off from other countries. And there he listed all of the countries that had been involved, including the likes of UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, and of course, Pakistan, the main mediator. And then the big one, Israel, does suggest that there has been sort of a group push to get this over the line. Now, as you say, the details matter. It's been, almost 12, 24 hours, I guess, since that post went up. And we still don't have a lot of detail as to what it pertains and what it includes. What we do understand, though, is something that Iran themselves have been pushing for, which is a bifurcation between the first step of the process, which is a reopening of the Strait, and then a deferral of sorts of all of the thornier topics around the nuclear file, the proxies, the militias, which are actually the meat of why the U.S. entered into the war in the first place. But what we don't understand is, and this is per President Trump's True Social post, it would lead to some fully unconditional reopening of the Strait with the proviso that the U.S. would be allowed to maintain a military presence there should the 60-day or 30-day ceasefire expire, and they would have to go back to military action. But at this point, we're still waiting for more details on what exactly this multi-phased framework is going to include.
Andrew, with the details that we do have, and those seem to be the same details members of Congress are getting based on their Twitter posts overnight, this is not making friends from a lot of people who are some pretty staunch allies of the president. Ted Cruz, Lindsey Graham, Senator Mike Johnson, and even former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo compared it to the JCPOA that his administration pulled out of and then got in a Twitter spat with a White House official who basically told him to shut the up. So this was interesting. Talk to us about what this almost immediate backlash from some of President Trump's staunchest allies in Congress means.
Yeah, I mean, certainly this is closer to the outcome that I think you would see a lot of Democrats wanting, which is to say, yes, it's closer to a return to the Obama era Iran deal than it is to anything approaching the victory that folks like Lindsey Graham have been very strongly advocating for. I think, certainly on the more hawkish parts of the party, you're seeing people who really want to have the U.S. go in and really take out Iranian nuclear capabilities and cause sort of maximum destruction in order to get the best bargaining position at the table. And clearly that is not what's happening here. The polling on this war suggests that the public is very much not in line with that position, and so naturally you're going to see some disalignment between folks like Lindsey Graham, especially, and Ted Cruz, who want to see a maximal U.S. involvement in this conflict. But with regards to the rest of Congress, I think Democrats have for a while now been trying to get in Iran war powers resolution over the line, slowly but surely been able to peel off more Republicans on the sort of isolationist, more America first, if you will, wing of the party. They were about to have a vote this past week, and they pulled it because they were concerned that more Republicans would defect and vote to end the war. So I think, at least a little bit, you're seeing domestic politics in the U.S. driving some of the administration's decision making here when it comes to, we need to end this thing sooner rather than later, because when Congress returns from its recess in June, they're probably going to have that war powers vote. Mike Johnson can only hold it off for so long, and it might be successful. And, obviously the Senate would struggle to pass that and Trump could veto it. But at the end of the day, that would be a huge symbolic blow to the administration. It would be the first time that a war powers resolution has managed to pass in the House. And I think it would reflect a lot of what we've been seeing in terms of public opinion as well, and really just sort of dovetail with that and send a strong message about where lawmakers are on the war.
Yeah, Andrew referencing there that tweet from Senator Cruz, he's saying, I'm deeply concerned about what we are hearing about an Iran deal being pushed by some voices in the administration. Jumana, let me turn to you, hearkening back to palliative cashgate from the Obama years. This was something the Republicans made a big deal about. The freeing of
the president
assets.
on the campaign trail.
On the campaign trail made a big deal about this as well. And so central to what we know of this plan, or what we're piecing together, the plan is perhaps the unfreezing of, $100 billion worth of frozen assets. Not front and center, I think. Yeah, or a portion thereof. How critical is this? Then I'm just curious more broadly about what we're hearing from in the region in terms of their response to what's being floated here. The president in a very rosy light, painting the conversations that he had yesterday in the Oval Office. I wonder sort of how on board Gulf leaders, again, not speaking of them as a monolith, but those leaders with whom he spoke yesterday feel about the prospects of a deal like this one.
Yeah, so a couple of things here. The war started 3 months ago, and I think you fast forward to today, and it's really remarkable that one of the main sticking points has been the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, which was not a problem before the war started. So we are centralizing a lot of the discussions around a problem that didn't exist before the US and Israel launched these military operations against Iran. So now we're in a situation where Iran have discovered that they have a lot of leverage over this key chokehold for the global economy, and they're not going to give it up without getting something in return. And for them, the incentive is clearly economic. And what they've been pushing for the last, several rounds of negotiations is for lifting of those sanctions so that they can get their oil free flowing again without the risk of sanctions. And the second point is, as you say, the unfreezing of some of the assets. And you say they amount about $100 billion. Now here, there's been, I think, a lot of discussion back and forth about the extent of how much the U.S. are comfortable in terms of lifting the current restrictions. But what I've seen, the numbers that I've seen that have been reported, amount to around 20 to 25 billion, which is still a substantial sum, but it's not necessarily handing over cash. It's just lifting of assets that have been frozen. Now, that's just one part of the discussion here. And I think to come back to your question about the Gulf Arab states, they don't want to be handing Iran a gift here. But the alternative was indeed on Friday, it really did look like the US were facing a big decision of whether to go down the diplomatic route or once again restart military hostilities. And I think the perception is that going down the hostilities route was just so much worse an option that the main goal had to be getting diplomacy and negotiations over the line to avert going back to a scenario where energy infrastructure and infrastructure in the region could once again be targeted. It's early days now because we still don't know what's in the deal. There will be a postmortem, and we will look back and see, how the Gulf Arab states are going to come out of this. But I think the perception now in the region is that there needs to be a full cessation of hostilities, and living in this frozen conflict with the Strait still somewhat controlled by Iran was never going to be a solution that was going to be acceptable. So at least you get short-term visibility. Medium-term, long-term, I think there's still a lot of concern that this situation could once again flare up, especially if there's not a full resolution to some of the thornier topics that we spoke about, the proxies, the militia, and of course, the nuclear file.
Andrew, if this does come together in kind of a deal like Jemana was just talking about, there is no guarantee, to her point, that Iran isn't going to change its mind if it's unhappy some point down the line and close the Strait, which to this point wasn't really an issue before this conflict started. Do you think when it comes to selling this agreement, not just to these Republicans who have been sounding off on Twitter, but when these Republicans go home and talk to their constituents, that that's going to be a harder sell? Do you think all these things the president has been hammering about are going to become liabilities when constituents who wanted America first, no intervention, and even the Iran hawks who wanted to take out the program realize we're kind of back to where we were before?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of a poison in a gun situation at this point, which is to say which causes the least amount of pain. And that's to say, right now, I think Republicans' main priority is ensuring that costs go down and gas prices stay down. And, every day that this conflict goes on, the Strait remains closed and oil isn't coming through, means pain at the pump for their voters and their constituents. And that's overwhelmingly what they're going to be hearing this coming week when they're back in their districts. And so the bottom line is always sort of a political risk for them to have the forbearance to let Trump continue to do this. And, the alternative obviously is to openly break with him. And we've seen, in Kentucky, the political consequences of that. Certainly, I think they're going to look at this deal, if not publicly, then privately at least, as a boon politically for the midterms, just because it means that much less headache in terms of gas prices and all the other supply chain
way to set it
issues
aside
that
as people go to the polls. Yeah.
Andrew Solender of Axios, thank you very much. Jemana Research, your colleague at Horizons Middle East and Africa, thank you very much for joining us as well. And Christina, I want to pull up this chart that we had accompanying the Bloomberg piece, which I think is so fascinating and gets to what you were just talking about. That is sort of what has changed between now and the beginning of this war. You look at Iran's nuclear program. Back before February 28th, it was degraded. As of May 20th, further damaged but not destroyed. Same with Iran's military capabilities. Iran's allies degraded, now further damaged but not destroyed. It's Iran's leadership here that draws my eye here. They faced internal challenges now. Yes, there have been these assassinations of key figures in Iran, but that leadership, the IRGC has an even stronger grip on the country than it did beforehand. And then, of course, we had sanctions before. Now we are dealing with all of the economic ramifications of this war. So desperately, the president wants to stave off those by getting oil flowing once again. But indications that I've seen, it won't be till 2027, even if this stopped tomorrow, when that flow of oil will be back to normal once again.
That's right. And if you look at the economic endpoint, $65 a barrel before February 28th, over $110 a barrel as of May 20th.
Yeah, the president unable to get those prices down again as we head to November, as Andrew pointed out. Well, coming up, SpaceX is getting ready for its mega IPO, the biggest ever. They're not the only ones planning a big public offering this year. How will that shape the stock markets at large? It's coming up next on Bloomberg This Weekend, on Bloomberg TV and Bloomberg Radio.
Thank you for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date on today's top stories. The death toll from a gas explosion at a coal mine in China's Shanxi province has been lowered. Authorities at a briefing, they lowered the casualties from 90 to 84. They said 2 people remain missing and 128 are hospitalized after Friday's blast. The cause of that explosion is still under investigation. Now, state media says it's the deadliest such incident since 2009. Cleanup efforts in Hawaii continue after a 6.0 magnitude earthquake hit the south side of the Big Island late on Friday. There are reports of damages to homes and structures, with roadway crews clearing debris after several rock slides occurred around the South Kona area. In company news, NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang says super microcomputer needs to tighten up on compliance after Taiwan detained 3 people for allegedly making fraudulent claims about AI servers made by its U.S. partner.
Ultimately, Supermicro has to run a new company just to provide us outside companies. And I hope that they will enhance and improve their regulation and compliance to avoid that from happening in the future.
Wong spoke with reporters after arriving in Taipei on Saturday. And Uber has offered to take over Delivery Hero in a deal that would value the German delivery company at about $11.6 billion. Uber looking to ramp up the competition with DoorDash outside of the U.S. I've never used either Uber or DoorDash.
You've not?
No.
Really?
I know. I haven't. I go pick up my food.
She picks up her own food. She's a
You
Costco
probably
regular.
run there and only eat vegetables anyway. But although we did see you eat that burger, so
Consumed. Lisa, thank you very much.
You got it.
Appreciate
Thanks,
that.
Lisa.
We could be just weeks away from a back-to-back-to-back series of IPOs. We could add Aura to the mix and make it back-to-back-to-back-to-back. Change the face of the equities market as we know them. SpaceX, OpenAI, and Anthropic all making plans to go public this summer or fall, with valuations soaring into the trillions, trillions of dollars.
All right. Joining us to put all that into perspective, Larry Tabb. He's the head of market structure research for Bloomberg Intelligence. Larry, let's start with SpaceX. Okay, they filed their prospectus. What was that process like, and what does the timeline look like for a company going public, especially a company that's this big?
The process is pretty significant. They need to go talk with the SEC. They have to put out all of their S1 and their information that goes back and forth with the SEC a number of times, and there are delays, like 30-day delays, and you updating something, them getting back to you. Then it's kind of a recursive process. It's kind of not easy, and and it's gotten harder over time, and that's one of the challenges, and why to a certain extent folks are challenged going public these days.
Why has it gotten harder?
Well, in trying to do the right thing, I think we've raised the bar on companies going public to a very large extent. You look at Enron and Sarbanes-Oxley that came out of Enron, and now all of a sudden, if anything goes wrong in any of your companies, the CEO is directly responsible. There's a lot of disclosure issues. There are a number of issues around liability. So there are law firms that basically buy a couple of shares of stock, and all you need is a 2,000 share holding to then start a class action lawsuit. And so if anything goes wrong with the IPO or anything goes wrong with any type of disclosure, you've got law firms jumping on the bandwagon to file lawsuits, and it just becomes very problematic for the company. And hopefully the SEC, the SEC does know this, and the chairman of the SEC, Paul Atkins, is trying to do his best to try to solve some of these issues.
Yes, he hasn't been shy about saying he wants to ease this process along. You mentioned how recursive it can
make
be.
Make IPOs great again.
Yes, make IPOs great again. I want to ask you how the exchanges are approaching this. So I saw the New York Stock Exchange kind of licking its wounds after all of this, but could you speak to the level of competition that's involved on the exchange size here? Obviously, each of the U.S. exchanges wants to get a piece of this here. They're fighting over these listings. What is the differentiating factor here? And I saw the New York Stock Exchange crying foul here, that they think that maybe NASDAQ got this in some sort of quasi-untoward way.
The process is pretty competitive, and honestly, there's not a whole lot of difference between going public on New York or NASDAQ these days. You either want to align yourself with the 200-plus-year-old New York Stock Exchange or the more tech-modern NASDAQ in Times Square, both of which give you marketing dollars and kind of promotional benefits. That said, there is a new stock exchange that's cropping up in Texas, the Texas Stock Exchange, that's trying to actually do something to make it significantly different to go public, but they haven't even launched, and creating a new exchange is not the easiest thing in the world, but they're trying to play around with, or they're working with the Texas legislature to change the rules to make it actually easier for companies to go public.
I do want to ask you about the valuations of some of these IPOs. All right, you've got SpaceX valuation up to $2 trillion, and then coming on the back of that, OpenAI may be eyeing a September IPO with a valuation of about $1 trillion. Someone was poking fun at this online and said, that's worth more than all the land in Australia. Sure, it's fine. Just keep buying it. Is there a concern that these valuations are not realistic?
Yeah, I can't really talk to the extent of realistic or non-realistic, but they're awfully, awfully high. If you look at NVIDIA, which is now worth over $5 trillion, that went public at south of $1 billion. So who's making this money? You look at Apple went public for like less than $2 billion, Microsoft less than $1 billion. These are multi-trillion-dollar companies now, and who's, and general investors and people with pensions and people with money in, the SPY and S&P 500 funds all have profited in the gain of these shares. Whereas now all of a sudden you've got SpaceX looking at 2 trillion IPO. I'm sure there are individuals that have some stock, but not a whole lot. It's mostly Elon, the employees, some early investors. They certainly haven't been the majority of individuals. And the other, if you look at the companies that have gone public, the top, the companies that, the companies worth $1 trillion, most of which have gone public for under 100 billion. Most of them have gone public for under 10 billion. And all that return has gone to you and I and folks with, 401ks and IRAs.
Larry,
and now all of a sudden, if all of a sudden now SpaceX, there's no way that SpaceX can make the same kind of return as NVIDIA or Google, because they'd have to swallow the GDP of the globe just to get there.
Larry, thank you very much. Larry Tabb giving us that intro there, that précis, that preview of what's to come here in terms of these IPOs. And I did see this note from Michael Hartnett at Bank of America, wondering about the prospect of these mega valuations here. That's going to change the makeup of the S&P 500, further the concentration that we've seen. Larry Tabb of Bloomberg Intelligence, thank you very much.
All right, you did see that breaking news swipe. We're going to go now overseas. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is in India, where he's meeting with Prime Minister Narendra Modi, among other things on the agenda. And just hours ago, he addressed a potential peace deal with Iran.
So his commitment to that principle that they'll never have a nuclear weapon shouldn't be questioned by anybody. And the idea that somehow this president, given everything he's already proven he's willing to do, is going to somehow agree to a deal that ultimately winds up putting Iran in a stronger position when it comes to nuclear ambitions is absurd.
Good morning, Eric. We're glad you could make time. I know you're on a very busy schedule. I want to ask you the same question we've been kind of asking everyone this morning. Do we have any more details about what is in or what is not in, or whether or not there is even a deal to be talking about? Any vibes or signs that we could be getting a tangible announcement later today?
Well, we don't have details yet, but this is the third time in about as many days that we've heard Secretary of State Rubio talk about progress having been made. And these seem to be some of the most upbeat comments that he's had so far, talking about this. Was now about 5 or 6 hours ago that he had this press conference with External Affairs Minister Jaishankar after their meeting here in New Delhi, but talking about expecting in the next several hours to potentially have news, but making clear that that would be announced by President Trump in Washington. And so, of course, now that we're getting into the day on Sunday there in Washington, we're anticipating or looking for signs of additional details and information from the White House and from President Trump. But Secretary Rubio talking about progress having been made, saying he didn't want to get too ahead of things in terms of talking about it, and didn't want to kind of overplay it, but also didn't want to kind of undersell it or to brush it off. Said there has been this progress and that he would let the president speak more to that during the course of the day.
Eric, we heard the Secretary of State say you want this to be the remit of the Secretary of State, not the Secretary of Defense or Secretary of War. It does beg the question, though, just about his level of engagement. You cover the State Department day in and day out, and as we've watched this conflict unfold, it doesn't seem like he has played the marquee or the point role for this administration. We've had Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, of course, the president.
Even J.D. Vance.
Vice President J.D. Vance going to those talks in Pakistan where you were, I know, Eric, as well. Just help us understand the role that Marco Rubio is playing here as we're trying to see some sewing up of a resolution here of this conflict.
Well, of course, Marco Rubio is the first, as they say, dual-hatted, the first person to be both National Security Advisor and Secretary of State simultaneously since Henry Kissinger about 50 years ago. And so the role that he's been playing, I think, has been more behind the scenes here. really managing the Situation Room meetings. And it's not always the public-facing part of this process that one sees. But for instance, we saw very early in the war that he briefed the press after his briefing of the intelligence committees of the committees of Congress about the U.S. strike on Tehran on February 28th. And so I think his role here has been more, behind the scenes and kind of management of the strategy and of that pursuit of the national security goal of making sure that Iran doesn't get a nuclear weapon. It's been more that than certainly the shuttle diplomacy, which we had seen prior to the war by Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, the envoys, as well as the very public trip about a month ago by Vice President Vance that I was speaking with you all from Islamabad. So I think that's kind of the way to understand how all of the players fit together here.
Eric, we've only got about 30 seconds left, but I do want to ask you if you've heard from the current Secretary of State about President Trump's last Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, being very critical of this proposed deal over Twitter, saying it seems straight out of basically the Obama administration's playbook. That's the JCPOA, pay the IRGC to build a WMD program and terrorize the world, not remotely America first. Have we heard any pushback or response from the Secretary of State about that today?
Well, yes, he was asked about that, and he really rejected that. I mean, he said that given what we've seen from President Trump, the commitment of the operations and the forcefulness of Operation Midnight Hammer last June, as well as Epic Fury beginning in late February, that really shows President Trump's seriousness about using force and maximum pressure to influence Iran's behavior. And so that's really been his response to some of that criticism we've seen.
All right, Eric Martin, traveling in India with Secretary of State. Thank you so much. And that is an excellent shirt, my friend. All right. Did you know Google processes some 15 billion searches every day? Our next guest literally wrote the book on what we Google, and it is maybe some more uplifting than you might think. That's next on Bloomberg This Weekend. Stick with us.
Thank you for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's update you on today's top stories. Iran's World Cup team has moved its base camp from the U.S. to Mexico after getting approval from FIFA. Now, the president of the Iran Football Federation announced the decision in a statement. FIFA, though, has not confirmed the move. Iran had been scheduled to train in Tucson, Arizona. The federation says the team will be based in Tijuana, Mexico, just south of San Diego. This year's World Cup, it runs from June 11th to July 19th and will be co-hosted by the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. In the NHL playoffs, Carolina Hurricanes, they topped the Montreal Canadiens 3-2 with the series tied. Tonight, the Colorado Avalanche take on the Vegas Golden Knights. The Golden Knights actually lead the series 2-0. And in the NBA, the Knicks are on a roll, beating the Cavaliers 121-108. They lead the series 3-0. Tonight, the Oklahoma City Thunder battles the San Antonio Spurs. OKC leads that series 2-1. The Knicks play again tomorrow. And the PGA Tournament continues today at TPC Craig Ranch in McKinney, Texas. Topping the leaderboard is Siwoo Kim at 21 under par. Tied for second is Scotty Scheffler and Wyndham Clark at 19 under par. And the first round of the 2026 French Open underway at Roland Garros in Paris. Coco Gauff is looking to defend her title on the women's side. There's guaranteed to be a new men's champion because Carlos Alcaraz is stepping out due to a wrist injury. And that puts Yannick Sinner in the spotlight on the most famous clay courts in the game. David and Christina, I did tennis.
Did tennis? Christina, you actually follow tennis, don't you?
And Lisa, you did a great job with all those names. You did really well.
Yeah, no, I agree. And you're becoming a real golf devotee, which I
thank you.
not
Those golf
expected.
scores, no, excellent. Thanks, Lisa. All right, David Gura.
Yes.
What do you Google?
That's a great question. We just did sports. I Google sports scores if I don't watch the end of a game. Recipes. If I'm traveling, I'll Google best hotel or restaurant in a given city. Very practical.
I feel like your
Daily
Google
stuff.
is very, very practical. Mine is a little chaotic, but yes.
Okay.
All right. Well, Simon Rogers has written a book.
I feel like I have to beg an answer. I have to ask you a follow-up on that. A little chaotic how?
You know me. My brain is just as chaotic. It's things that I should know, but I'm not sure about. I check on
It's
maps.
more of a life guide for you.
There's a lot of where am I in New York's happening right now, but we'll move on from
Sorry
that.
to interrupt.
All right. So my friend Simon Rogers, has written a book on exactly that. He's Google's data editor, and before that, he was the data guy at Twitter. He's also the winner of one of the most amazingly hyper niche awards I've ever heard of, which is the Royal Statistical Society's Award for Statistical Excellence in Journalism. Simon, you giant nerd. It's so nice to see you.
I feel such a nerd today. Thank you for having me.
The book is What We Asked Google. Let's start with the question that Christina posed to me as she hoists it up here. Broadly speaking, what are the bulk of queries about on the search engine?
So the bulk of queries are really about the everyday stuff. I mean, I think we tend to focus on the big news events, which makes sense. When something happens, we want to understand it. But really, for most of us, it's just getting through the day. It's parenting. It's like pets, food, health, grief, these kind of big moments. And I've not seen a kind of real exploration of that everyday nature of search. So that's what I wanted to look at.
It's really fun, and you break it down into different sections, and there is so much data in here. I understand why you won that award. Your very first chapter is called Why Am I So Tired?, which I think is the refrain of modern adulthood. But a lot of it, surprised me, is about time. People search, like, what time is it? They search, around 2 a.m. you say you see a spike in parents searching for how to get their kids to sleep. Why do we have daylight savings time? Why do we have leap year? And then what time is it in Ukraine spiked around the invasion?
Yeah, exactly. It's a real mix of the everyday. So, you can't get your babe sleep around 2 a.m. You're not alone. You're sharing it with millions of people around the world. And also there is a kind of rhythm to the way that we search, and it applies during the year as well. So people search for how to play piano in December, ahead of Christmas, right? And right now people are searching for graduation. A month ago it was prom. A month before that it was promposals. And that's a global search now. That was one of these things which, I grew up in England, did not grow up with proms, and now it's a global thing. So you see these searches kind of spread around the world.
Could you talk a bit about your approach to the job? So look, I search on Google, and it auto-populates it sometimes, what other people are asking questions of. But when you're faced with this gigantic, doesn't even do it justice, trove of data, how do you begin to piece through? What are you looking for? What are you hoping to glean from all that you can aggregate from our use of it?
I mean, for me, I'm really interested in the humanity behind the searches. So, for instance, whenever there's a hurricane, you'd expect people to be searching for battening down the hatches and, buying emergency supplies, but people also search for how to calm a dog in a storm, which I love that search. Yeah, I mean, it's very human, right? And I think that there is a kind of humanity which comes across searches, which maybe we're lacking a little bit in the way we think about each other, but actually you can really see it come through. Like searches for help are higher now than ever before, and they're often about helping other people.
I thought that was so interesting because the premise of this seems like nightmare fuel. There's a UK game show called Taskmaster, and they recently had a challenge where contestants had to do a really scary thing, and the guy who won let them read his search history live on the show. Because it seems like it could bring out the worst in us. But to your point, there's some really cute and kind of reaffirming moments. One of them is in June, people search like how to save a bee because bees are out and they want to rescue them, which I thought was really cute. But talk to us about some of the other things that as you're looking through this data made you find commonalities, not things that separate us.
Yeah, I mean, I knew I wanted to write the book, and I started doing it a couple of months after my mum had died. And anybody who's joined that club, you feel incredibly alone. You're the only person this has ever happened to. And when you start looking at the data, you realize that not only are you not the only person this ever happened to, there are lots of people in the same situation, but people are also searching for how to help others in that situation, like the right thing to say or the right bit of poetry to read or whatever it is. And that kind of gave me a couple of themes of the book, really, because this idea that you're not alone, even if you feel lonely, you're one of a community of people who are doing similar things, whether or not you know it. And also that other people are trying to help you, which is kind of reassuring and reaffirming. And also, really, that we know nothing. About everyday life, whether it's how to boil an egg or how to tie a tie, these things, and we're not ashamed to ask for it.
How is your life being transformed by AI and the way that people are using it to ask some of these questions? And I think about the rigor of thinking. I think a criticism of AI is somebody might search a query like you just asked, what time is it someplace? And this is something that we could answer very basically if we obtained a wristwatch or looked at the clock across the room, and it's using all of this computing power to find this very basic question. I'm curious how you think about that, just the way in which we're using search and how that's kind of transforming our approach to finding out what in some cases is very basic information.
Yeah, my favorite is how to tell the time drunk,
Very good.
which is most searched in London, which is no surprise to me. There is a change, and revolution happening in the way people search. And we had some data out this week around the way that people search with AI mode in Google, which is, we've had for a year now. So obviously we've got over 20 years of regular search history, and now we've got a year of AI search history. So it's really early days, but what you're seeing is that queries are getting longer. They're much more specific now than they used to be. So you'll see a car in a movie, and you want to know what brand it is, or you'll hear a song and you want to know what instrument they played on it. And they're much more conversational. So people will go back and forth and kind of return to it because...
That's so interesting to me, because as a kid who grew up in the 2000s, there was this thing called Ask Jeeves, where you could, before people knew how to query, you could put, what is, blank, and it would find it to you in Google search terms. We're so primed to just enter keywords. It's interesting to me now that we're going back to searching in natural language models.
It's a whole new set of skills, isn't it? And I think it's basically, people are just asking how they want to ask. So me and my son, we're doing up an old BMW at the moment, stupidly complicated. And so we're doing a lot of these very kind of weird diagnostic things where we'll come back and we'll go back to it. So you're really seeing it in that way. And also searches are becoming much more kind of multimodal. And by that you mean that people are searching not just on the phone or on a laptop, but they're searching with a voice or a home device. But my sense is, and it's early, is that the things we're searching for are staying the same. We're still searching for love and relationships and health and hope and that sort of thing.
It dawned on me. I liked towards the end, you end on a nice note, and you have a graph that shows the number of people searching for a job that makes money and the number of people searching for a job that helps people. And over time, the line for helping people far surpasses the one for people wanting to make money. Why do you think that is, and what's your biggest takeaway?
I mean, I think you're seeing these social changes happening. And you can see the data through search. So, for instance, searches for take care of parents have overtaken searches for take care of kids. We're the sandwich generation, maybe you're looking after parents and looking after children. And a lot of these kind of big social trends you can see showing up in search.
Simon, thank you so much. The book is What We Google. Thank you for coming in. And if you need to feel better about humanity, I highly endorse it. All right, for more reviews and recommended books, please sure to subscribe to the new Bloomberg Weekend newsletter on books. You can sign up at bloomberg.com/newsletters.
Here's one thing we may be Googling: how to save on your summer vacation, especially with prices rising due to the war in Iran. Bloomberg's expert on travel and finances, Jody Lurie, joins us live next on Bloomberg This Weekend, on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, at Bloomberg.com, and on the Bloomberg Business
We'll be right back.
Welcome back to Bloomberg This Weekend. Memorial Day is tomorrow. Millions of Americans are kicking off the unofficial start of the summer travel season. But with the war in Iran putting a strain on energy prices, are consumers still planning to get away?
All right, joining us now is Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Credit Analyst Jody Lurie. Jody, you just released this annual travel survey, and I was scrolling through it this morning. There's a lot of interesting information there. It seems like people are curtailing travel, but only in certain sectors, like more domestic than overseas. Is that financial? Is that security reasons? And what are the numbers that you're seeing?
So I think it's really interesting. So just taking a step back, our travel survey, we do it every April and November. This is our 6th one that we've done. And we poll people and we say, okay, is vacation a priority? Or what are your priorities?
Yeah.
And out of the 3,100 or so people that responded, 1,000 said vacation's a priority. Once that's true, then we ask them a ton of vacation questions. Obviously, if they're not traveling, we don't care.
Sure.
They're not going to have preference on Delta over United. So what we found in April, which is so interesting, and mind you, we did this right before hantavirus, right before Ebola, so it's not related to health scares that are, circulating at the moment, is that people are still traveling, very much so, still traveling, and people are planning already to increase their budgets should costs exceed them. So they're saying, okay, I know that inflation exists. 56% of people said inflation exists. I'm feeling it.
Yeah.
I'm scared about inflation. That's the reason why I'm increasing more. But 24% already increased significantly going into this year, already increased significantly from the start of the year. So that's pretty substantial.
Yeah.
Are they making difficult decisions about how they're getting to one place or another? We had somebody on yesterday. We were talking about that age-old calculus: do I drive or do I fly? Is that being thrown out of whack because of the rising cost of both fuel for the car and fuel for planes?
A little bit, David, but I will say that more so it's the quality. So people want to spend more on accommodations. They want to live large with accommodations. They want to live large with premium and business class travel.
This is Christina's story completely.
But
they just keep making fun of me because I like fancy travel and I'm too cheap to spend it, so I end up just staying here. Is what ends up happening.
Well,
I'm not one of the people who will spend it, but it sounds like people will.
Well, I don't think you're unusual there. So I will tell you that despite the fact that people want to go and they want, that first class experience, they want that nice, fancy Waldorf Astoria
100%.
experience, they're also saying that they can't necessarily spend that kind of money. So they're willing to cut back on accommodations and they're willing to cut back on business travel. And so while they want to spend on the high-end hotel, they might settle for the mid-level hotel, which is interesting because my colleague Brian Egger on the equity side has written something similar related to the C-shaped economy, which is something that Hilton said.
I was just going to ask you if this is a K-shaped travel economy. All right, so tell me about a new letter. Why is it a C-shape?
Right, exactly. Why is it a C-shape? Right. So I like the K-shape better. I think it's a little more understandable, but the concept of the C-shape is that people are trading down. So they're like gradually trading down to mid-tier. I think probably that upper echelon, there's no like C there.
Probably like a straight line there. But
yeah. There's like maybe like a double C or something. I don't know.
So who is benefiting from what you're seeing these trends? Is it a certain hotel chain, a certain airline? Especially if you're cutting back overseas travel, I imagine that benefits some airlines more than others.
Right. So I think the major airlines are still going to do well. My colleagues in Princeton and I, so George Ferguson and Francois Duflot. We've been working together on this, and something that we've seen is that people are still willing to use the majors. And, and they're benefiting from the fact that higher income earners are still very much traveling. There is a dichotomy in that K-shape, right? And so what we're seeing is that high income earners are still willing to travel. They might not travel as fancy, but they're still willing to travel, and they're also more loyal to some of these brands. So you will see that the Marriotts, the Hiltons, the Hyatts, the Delta, the United, and the American might do a little bit better than some of these other lower tier, second level brands.
Interesting.
Do we have any sense of how long this commitment to traveling will last? I think of the survey that we got on Friday, the University of Michigan survey, showing consumer sentiment at this really low point in a trough. And it just made me wonder, how long can this continue? Yes, we're seeing consumers feeling the pressure of inflation, moving things around as you've suggested. I'm prioritizing this or that. I'm going to do more of this or less of that. Is there a point at which people will say, enough's enough, I'm not going to do this? Or are we not there yet? Are they not getting themselves to that point at which they'll say, I can't afford to travel, I'm not going to do it?
So, David, every time we run the survey, I wonder if we're going to finally
if we're there.
if we're going to see the end of the consumer, right? So we had the revenge travel, right? Revenge spending right before COVID, right after COVID, right?
Yeah.
And it was this giant boom. And then we said, okay, that can't live forever. And we are seeing some areas of weakness, like in regional theme parks and some of the destination theme parks as well. We're not seeing the weakness in cruise lines so much. That's been very surprising, despite everything going on in the world, despite the Middle East, despite health scares back and forth, despite other wars that have happened.
Prices going up because of fuel and everything
exactly.
else.
And prices going up. And it's not like the cruise lines aren't charging more, because they are starting to do a little bit more of the a la carte, which is basically nickel and diming, right? So you don't get, on most cruise lines, you don't get, soft drinks for free. You also have to pay for the excursions. You have to pay for all the
Diet
extras.
Coke?
Yeah, not on Disney, actually. Fun fact.
All right, good to know.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing that struck me is you found that 76% of those surveyed, Diet Coke, we were talking about this yesterday. It's like the only thing that all of us will drink is Diet Coke.
Make your travel decisions based on
Coke
it.
Zero?
Yeah, no.
I'm not getting into that. Okay, but to put a point on everything you've been talking about very quickly, because I'm getting told we're running out of time, but 76% of those surveyed said spending on travel is more important than spending on clothing.
Correct. People are just going to go, I guess, to the nude beaches. I don't know.
There you go.
No, I'm just kidding.
That's it.
It's more that people care about actually going and traveling. And I think people are also not spending on clothing the same way, right? So they're buying secondhand. They're looking at different ways to cut back so that they can have the Instagrammable photos, right?
I guess you can't secondhand.
She's got your number. The Diet Coke, the Disney cruise, the Instagrammable photos. Jody Lurie, thank you very much for joining us here.
Do you want to come be my co-host? I'm breaking up with this one.
Really appreciate it. Jody Lurie, Bloomberg Intelligence, joining us here in New York. We are coming up on 9 a.m. in New York. We're going to speak with Democratic Congressman Glenn Ivey next.
We'll be right back.
This weekend.
Possibly. Breaking news, nearing a deal. President Trump says an agreement with Iran will be announced shortly.
He would much rather have me and the Department of State solve this problem than the Department of War having to solve this problem. But the problem's going to be solved one way or the other.
Can negotiators get it across the finish line, and will it hold?
Shots fired near the White House.
President Trump has said a deal is close, only for the two sides to remain far apart.
Secret Service says it killed a gunman after he approached a checkpoint and began shooting.
Plus, President Trump finally endorses a candidate in the Texas Senate runoff. We're live in the Lone Star State ahead of this major test of the president's picking power.
Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend. We are coming to you live from Bloomberg's world headquarters in New York City. I'm David Gura.
I'm Christina Ruffini. We're here with Lisa Mateo. It is Sunday, May 24th. And of course, the big story we're tracking this morning is news or word or possibility of a deal with Iran, a deal that would reopen the Strait and cause at least a temporary ceasefire in those hostilities. Now, of course, there has been a ceasefire that has been holding for quite a while,
6
but that
weeks,
Strait
yeah.
is still not open. And the U.S. increasingly under pressure from Gulf allies to move the needle on that at almost any other cost.
All we're working with here are reports from news organizations, including Bloomberg, and this post on Truth Social from the president yesterday had this Oval Office meeting, and it was an eventful day at the White House, to say the least. That took place. We heard about that from the president, and there was a shooting outside the White House as well. And our colleague Lisa Mateo is going to get us up to speed on all of that in her headlines right now. Lisa.
Yes, let's get to that other big story, the shooting outside the White House, where sources say the 21-year-old man had a prior encounter with authorities near the White House in July 2025. And that's when he was arrested for unlawful entry. He had also been involuntarily held for a mental assessment by authorities weeks earlier after another incident. ABC's Selena Wang was taping a story outside the White House when this all unfolded.
President Trump has said a deal is close, only for the two sides to remain far apart.
All reporters were told to run to the White House briefing room right after that. It took place just after 6 p.m. local time yesterday. Sources tell Bloomberg the man had been pacing along the street for some time before approaching a police checkpoint near 17th Street and Pennsylvania Avenue, pulled a gun from his bag and opened fire. Secret Service fired back, striking him. He was taken to a local hospital where he later died. A bystander was also hit by gunfire. No Secret Service members were injured. President Trump was inside the White House at the time and is okay. Investigators looking into what led up to that shooting. To the conflict in the Middle East, where President Trump said in a social media post that a peace deal with Iran was nearing completion and that the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz would be announced shortly. Axios reported the pact would involve a 60-day extension of the ceasefire where the Strait would then be reopened and Iran would be allowed to sell its oil. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who is in India for a 4-day visit with talks with senior Indian officials, also commented on those developments.
Suffice it to say that some progress has been made, significant progress, although not final progress has been made.
Rubio adding that there is still some work to be done if the plan succeeds. He said it could leave us with just a completely open strait, but also one without tolls, and would address nuclear concerns as well. Ukrainian authorities say Kyiv came under a massive Russian drone and missile barrage. It comes hours after President Volodymyr Zelensky and the US Embassy warned of an imminent strike. The mayor of Kyiv saying on Telegram that at least 2 people were killed and 44 injured. And California Governor Gavin Newsom has declared a state of emergency in Orange County as authorities work to cool an overheated chemical storage tank and keep it from exploding. Now, they say the main concern is that that tank, it could fail, crack, releasing chemical onto the ground, or yes, ultimately explode. The tank is located less than a mile from Disneyland's 2 theme parks. So Dave and Christina, they're just keeping track of the temperature of that.
Wild how much that temperature has spiked from something in the 70s to the 90s, as you say, close to Disneyland, close to Knott's Berry Farm as well. So this is a populated area, and I think tens of thousands of people have been evacuated thus far. Keep an eye on that over the course of the morning.
Thank you, Lisa.
All right, the Trump administration, as we mentioned, expressing optimism about a potential Iran peace deal.
Back with us, we have Jemana Secy. Also joining us are Bloomberg's managing editor of America's Weekend, Kevin Whitelaw, and Politico's White House reporter, Sophia Kai. Sophia, you're our guest this morning. Let's start with you. Thank you for joining us. I'm wondering, I think I know the answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway. I'm wondering if we've heard any updates from the White House. You know, we had this Truth Social post, very bullish on potentially reaching a deal from the president last night, and so far it's been a little bit quiet this morning. Any inclination that this is real and that officials are going to be able to get something across the line in time for us to announce before Monday morning starts?
You know, we've got a holiday weekend, so of course Tuesday is another big day, but we've not heard anything since last night. You know, this Iran deal has been very complex. And what we saw White House officials and a lot of White House allies yesterday do was they started batting down criticism from within their own party about contours of a deal that nobody really knows what's in it.
A lot of criticism we've been talking about, I mean, not only from very strong allies of the president, including Lindsey Graham, Ted Cruz, and others, but even from Mike Pompeo.
Roger Wicker, statement from Roger Wicker. Yeah.
And a White House official got into a spat with former Secretary of State under Trump, Mike Pompeo, who had been the person, when I was covering him, who was the advocate of pulling out of the original Iran nuclear deal, basically saying this is not far enough. Either finish the job or why did we do it in the first place?
That's exactly it, including Senator Lindsey Graham. I mean, we saw a spat between Senator Ted Cruz and Alex Bruesewitz, who is an important White House ally. That only raises more questions about what is in the deal, where are the conversations now, and where is the administration's red line about what they're able to accept? I think, you know, very rarely do you see this sort of widespread criticism of conservatives, of their own allies that they've been working with on Iran.
Jumana, let me ask you a basic fundamental question here is, what are we talking about? I look at the Wall Street Journal this morning. The agreement, if completed, wouldn't achieve Trump's main goal of preventing Iran from ever acquiring a nuclear weapon. You and the two of us have talked about this over many weeks, the evolving rationale for this conflict in the Middle East. But so central to it, and the refrain we've heard over and over again from the president is Iran can never be allowed to have a nuclear weapon. Now it seems, again, from the reporting that we're piecing together this morning, that might not be fundamental to this. That might not be a core tenet of this 14-point plan that the president is talking about.
Look, it goes back to what we've been discussing over the course of the last 3 months, which is what exactly were the US's military objectives here? And they seem to evolve and change over the course of the war since the ceasefire. But more recently, President Trump has been reiterating that the main goal was to ensure that Iran would not go on to develop a nuclear weapon. Does this MOU or this framework that's going to be announced address that? We simply don't know because we don't have the details yet. But what has emerged is another central issue that didn't exist before the war, and that is the fate of the Strait of Hormuz. Before the war, remember, ships were passing through unconditionally. There was no concern at all about this key maritime passage. And here we are 3 months later, Iran have identified that this is a key point of leverage that they're going to continue to have over Gulf states and over the global economy. And they are using that leverage to extract concessions from the US on what it would appear to be economic sanctions, on some relief, on the assets fund freezing and so forth. And that is just being addressed in the first phase of these discussions as they're being widely reported. The nuclear file, which is central to why the US entered into the war in the first place, is going to be deferred to later. And we don't even know at this point what exactly Iran are committing to. And judging by, again, what news outlets are reporting, Iran are only making verbal commitments at this point that they will not go on to build a nuclear weapon. Again, there seems to be a lot of difference between the various timeframes that the US are pushing for versus what Iran are willing to accept on their suspension of uranium enrichment. And then, of course, the fate of that highly enriched uranium stockpile, with various reports, again, over the last couple of days, saying that the new supreme leader is saying that under no circumstances will that highly enriched stockpile actually ever leave Iran. Another option is for that stockpile to be diluted. And by the way, this is just the nuclear file. We're not even talking about the proxies that Iran fund around the region, which is a clear point of consideration for Gulf states and for Israel. And the other point is the ballistic weapons that they're still sitting on. And yes, the US and Israel have managed to inflict a lot of military damage and industry damage, but Iran still have the ability to go back and rebuild over the coming years. And I think this is going to be a key point of concern as we think about the long-term effects of this war in years to come.
Kevin, I do want to pick up on what Jumana was talking about, what we've talked about as well, and that's these disconnects already from the messaging we're seeing from these two governments, especially when it comes to two things. One is the Strait, and the other is the nuclear program. New York Times is reporting 2 U.S. officials said that Tehran has agreed to give up its stockpile of highly enriched uranium, but 3 senior Iranian officials said the deal said nothing about the fate of Iran's nuclear program, and that's something that's going to be negotiated within 30 to 60 days. Critics of the way these negotiations have been going, even before now, have pointed out there has been a sequencing issue. If the U.S. wants to do this in stages, it has to give up its leverage, which is the blockade in the Strait, in order to get to those nuclear talks, at which point, why would Iran agree to any of this?
Well, look, I think this has been a problem all along, where these negotiations have gone on there were nuclear talks. They were then cut short by the attacks. So I think we have a massive trust problem on both sides. We clearly have very different messaging to, in many cases, I think, domestic audiences that about what is in the deal and what isn't in the deal. I think the best way to probably think about this is this may well be a brief ceasefire, whether that's 1 month, 2 months, 60 days is the number that seems to be the most solid at this point. It's unclear if there's any movement whatsoever on any of these key issues we've been talking about. So it doesn't mean that there's a peace deal. It just means that there may be an agreement not to shoot at each other for a little while, and maybe allow at least some ships to go through the Strait and at least temporarily ease some of the pricing pressure that we've seen in the oil markets. That may be what Trump is trying to do there. Look, there's also an outside case that the U.S. is going to put down what it thinks the deal is and let Iran reject it, and then the hawks in the administration will say, well, now it's time to strike again. But it is very clear that Trump is feeling the pressure, the political pressure to get out of this conflict, to stop it. He wants to be done with it. And so if this arrangement, this MOU, the 60-day plan gives him a way out, he may well try to seize it.
Sophia, let's talk more about this kind of potpourri of pushback, these posts of pushback from members of the president's own party. I'm curious if you think that those are entirely grounded in principle, if that's how you read those, or incumbent in them is this awareness that the midterms are right around the corner. We got to get through these runoff in Texas this week, but there's increasing agita among Republicans about what this will mean going into those midterm elections. And I'm curious, when you see that level of pushback, again, does it have to do with longstanding principle, or does it have to do with the fact that the political realities are becoming so difficult for Republicans in particular?
Well, I think the president is the person who's really feeling the political realities. I think the people that you're hearing from are people who have principles when it comes to Iran. And I think what they're reacting to is this elephant in the room of, are we in a better spot now than we were before the US struck Iran? And I think most of them are still inclined to support the president's decision to strike Iran in the first place. But I think as they've seen the events unfold, they're seeing, okay, they've still got their nuclear stockpile. They've still got their uranium. And Iran has realized that they've got this new leverage point of the Strait of Hormuz. And I think the energy prices, somebody like Susie Wiles in the White House has been concerned about energy prices even before the Iran war. That has exacerbated Susie's concerns. It's exacerbated the concerns of everybody in the administration who cares about whether Republicans will hold the House. And, so that's kind of where we are. And Trump in particular, he said when he came back from his visit to China, he said, look, Americans don't want another war 5,000 miles away. So he's very cognizant that he kind of needs to come out of this and show the American people that it was worth it. And that second part of, was this worth it, is something that his own allies are questioning right now.
Giovanna, I'm wondering how Gulf allies feel about that same question, because you brought up the other big outlying thing that I've seen in none of the reporting from either side about what's in this deal, and that's the ballistic missile program, which obviously is degraded but not put out, and defensive stockpiles are degraded around the Gulf from trying to counter those incoming munitions, especially at the start of the war. The other thing is our colleagues have put together on Bloomberg.com, and if you have a terminal, a very interesting graph on what the state of play was before the war and after the war. And And one of the ones that goes from green to red is the Strait of Hormuz, right? Before it was open, it wasn't an issue. Now it's under Iran control or U.S. blockade. And then there are also talks and rumors of Oman and Iran possibly collaborating on a toll system. Is there any guarantee that if Iran doesn't like this deal in 6 months to a year, it has this tool it didn't really know it had before, and that's it can close the strait again? Doesn't it seem like the state of play has fundamentally changed no matter what is in this deal?
Yeah, I do agree with you. And I think we will look back at this moment, at this war, as a game-changing war for the region. And namely because Iran have discovered that they have, number one, this huge point of leverage around the Strait of Hormuz. And already on the back of that, you're seeing Gulf countries look to diversify away and avoid passing through the Strait of Hormuz. UAE just announced that they're building another land pipeline that should be completed by 2027 to help transit more of their oil. And so the countries that will stand to recover more quickly are the ones that exactly have that ability to bypass the straits in coming years, not the case for the likes of Iraq and Kuwait, for example. But the other thing that you mentioned is often overlooked. It's not just about the Strait of Hormuz. Iran has also demonstrated that they can cause a significant amount of both psychological damage and infrastructure damage just by sending over these low-cost drones. And while, yes, most of them have been intercepted, the UAE interception rate very, very high, that's not to say that some of them didn't penetrate through the air defense system and cause a significant amount of damage, which we're still going to be processing and dealing with in the coming months. So I think there is most definitely a concern in the region that having a hostile and angry neighbor on your doorstep is not an outcome that anybody would have wished for, especially because so many of these economies are building up these visions that are underpinned by them being an oasis of stability in a region that tends to be quite unstable. And I think what's happened over the past couple of months is that assumption has been challenged. And that is why, to come back to what you were saying, you have seen this shift in sentiment in the last couple of weeks or so, in that all of these Gulf states, including the UAE, who have been the most hawkish, have actually been pushing for a diplomatic solution because the risk of another escalation is so high and it challenges that economic stability that they've been working so hard to build. Does it solve all the problems? Absolutely not, but it is the more palatable option out of the two options right now.
Shibana Secy, thank you very much. Appreciate you joining us this morning. Kevin Whitelaw, Sophia Kai, thanks for your attendance on Bloomberg This Weekend on this Sunday morning amidst so much breaking news. Hope to have you back soon. And Christina, again, we were in this waiting posture, waiting to hear more. I think the way that we responded to that post yesterday was, this seems imminent, but we have been here before. We've talked about that over the course of this 100%. Morning as well.
And talking to Jeff this morning, Jeff Mason, earlier in the hours, he was saying that they had thought something similar was happening even earlier this week. They had a call set up. They were told to come to a press conference. Usually you get a briefing before and that got pulled down as well. So again, a lot of moving parts. You know, with diplomacy, nothing's agreed to until everything's agreed to. So we'll have to see.
Until the ink is dried.
All right, coming up, we're going to speak live with Maryland Congressman Glenn Ivey. That is straight ahead on Bloomberg This Weekend, Bloomberg.com, radio, TV, and all our streaming platforms. Stay with us.
Thanks for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's update you on today's top stories. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth delivered the commencement address to graduating cadets at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point yesterday, telling them that they could soon be called to serve in war.
And now today, we are going to send you. We're sending you to lead. We're sending you to forge warriors. And we're sending you, perhaps, to war. And you are ready.
Hegseth did not specifically mention the war in Iran. He also criticized DEI and what he called woke policies in the military. Congo has suspended flights to the eastern city of Bunia due to escalating cross-border risks from Ebola as the outbreak spreads across 3 provinces. The U.S. has expanded its Ebola response, announcing enhanced airport screening requirements for travelers arriving from Congo, Uganda, and South Sudan, along with new emergency funding, medical supply shipments, and disaster response teams. More details on the death of NASCAR driver Kyle Busch. His family released a statement saying Busch died after severe pneumonia progressing to sepsis. The two-time NASCAR champion, he died on Thursday. He was preparing to race today at the Coca-Cola 600 at Charlotte Motor Speedway. All 39 drivers will race with a black number 8 decal on their car to honor Busch. And the course at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway will light the pylon on lap 18. Busch was 41. David and Christina.
Such a terrible story. Yeah, thank you very much, Lisa. Appreciate that update.
Thank you, Lisa. All right, President Trump says a potential deal with Iran, as we've been talking about, may now be within reach, announcing on social media last night that the deal is, quote, largely negotiated and could be finalized soon.
But even as the White House signals optimism about diplomacy, there are some major questions that remain about what concessions may be on the table, whether Congress will have any role in these negotiations, and how members of President Trump's own party are responding to the possibility of a deal. Joining us now is Democratic Congressman Glenn Ivey from the 4th District in Maryland. Great to have you with us once again. And I'm going to rip up the script here. We're going to get to Iran in just a moment. But I know that you served on the task force on the attempted assassination of Donald J. Trump. And with that experience, I wanted to ask you to comment on what we saw outside the White House yesterday. Somebody who tried to get in, fired a weapon, was shot dead by Secret Service as a result of that. What do you make of that occurrence in complement to what we saw less than a month ago at the White House Correspondents Association dinner? The fact that the president is a target here, reporters are a target as well. How is your focus shaped by the work that you did on that task force?
You know, there was a scenario yesterday where really the guy wasn't any place near the president or any intended target, apparently. And I think he'd had 2 prior incidents like that. He seemed to be someone trying to make a statement more so than actually, trying to get to the president. Butler was a whole different scenario. So that was one where, another inch slightly to the right, he would have been killed. And so, I think the Secret Service has learned a lot from the mistakes that were made at Butler and made improvements and adjustments. But, when the president's out, especially at campaign events or open events like that, those are going to be much different scenarios than when he's in the White House or safely ensconced inside a building with a, extended perimeter around it.
After that incident, the president did, I would say tweet, but it's not, it's a Truth Social, saying that, presidents need a safe and secure place, inferring, I think, that this is justification again for the ballroom. You're on appropriations. Do you think the president is going to get that funding? And do you think that's something that's needed?
Well, no, I don't think that it's needed. I mean, for example, if you built the ballroom, I guess the suggestion he's making is that every event he would do publicly would be in the ballroom, which of course is preposterous. The president has to go around and, do events out about the country and overseas. So building the ballroom doesn't fix the issues that we saw at Butler, unless he wants to cloister himself in the White House for the rest of his term. And I know that he doesn't. The other part of that, too, is when people are running for president, and they haven't been elected yet, we're still going to have the same issues about them campaigning outside of the White House because they can't do it in the White House to start with. That's government property, and you can't do a campaign on government property. So it's a total red herring from that perspective. Whether he gets the funding or not, I think even the Senate Republicans were balking at the amount and the change in the ask. I think initially when he floated this, all the money was going to come from the private sector, which I think is still inappropriate because of potential influence. But, now it's $1 billion from taxpayer money. I don't see why we would want to do that.
I love that shade from the House Appropriations. Even the Senate appropriators were balking at that amount. Let me ask you to respond to what we heard from the president yesterday, sort of how you're thinking about the prospects of a deal here. Yes, you sit on appropriations. Your remit isn't strictly in foreign affairs, but you're thinking, I'm sure, about the cost of this war, the widening cost and remit of this war. Where do you think we are in these negotiations? Are you satisfied that Congress at least has enough blanket awareness of what's going on in these negotiations?
No, I think we've been totally marginalized. I know there's, their lead House members and Senate members on foreign affairs and intelligence and the like, and the leaders are supposed to get additional information, and maybe they are, but I haven't been hearing exactly what that is, and I think they've been frustrated as well. So the other problem too is, there's no other way to say it, but the administration lies all the time about the status of these negotiations. He's been saying they're close to a deal now for week after week, and nothing seems to happen. And the one time where they did actually float specifics, I think that the things that Iran had proposed were totally unacceptable. I'm hoping we can at least get back to a place where we were as well off as we were under the Obama treaty. At this point, please just reopen the Strait of Hormuz first and foremost. To talk about doing something with respect to the nuclear piece, I don't know that he can get there from where he is. And even then, he lied about, I guess he said in June, I thought he'd obliterated all of their nuclear capability. And here we are again. So it's really hard to know what you can believe from the administration or not. But at a minimum, he needs to include Congress, the leadership from the House and the Senate from both parties. Let's work together and see if we can get out of the mess that he's created.
Well, speaking of working together, there was a surprising amount of backlash from your Republican colleagues in both chambers last night, responding to even the outlines of this potential deal, saying it didn't go far enough. It left us in a worse place than the U.S. and the region were before this conflict started. Watching people like Lindsey Graham, Ted Cruz, stalwart allies of the president, come out openly on Twitter, on X, and post that this is a bad idea, do you think that helps any kind of coalescence for some of the things that Democrats have been trying to get done, and that is to curtail some of this Pentagon funding or to actually pass a war powers resolution?
I think we're going to get the war powers resolution eventually, and I think it's going to be hard for the Republicans to sustain the position that the war should keep going when it's putting so much pain and financial pain on the American people. I just filled up my gas tank yesterday in the car, and it was like over $80. And I'm not driving a big SUV. Gas costs $1.50 more than it did just a few months ago. Every American's feeling that, and they're gritting their teeth at the Trump administration every time they have to pay for that tank of gas. So I think that's unsustainable. The problem, he's painted himself into a corner, though. He made big, statements about what he was going to get out of this. And it's not clear that he can get there. And he's put, especially Senate Republicans, but many of my House Republican colleagues as well, in a really tough situation. On the one hand, they want to get out of this war because of the gas prices and the impact and the total unpopularity of it. On the other hand, if he gets out but doesn't, achieve any of the goals that he put out there at the front end, he can't save face. He looks like he failed. I think he's going to have to swallow this hard and try and move forward from there. Because I'm not seeing an easy path forward. And Iran has successfully stalemated us, on the ground on this. So I don't know how he's going to get out of this situation. I don't see an exit ramp that's easy for him, but he's going to have to do something. He's going to have to do it fast.
I want to get the perspective of Glenn Ivey, former assistant U.S. attorney for the District of Columbia, on this anti-weaponization fund that was announced this week. $1.8 billion here for those who have grievances against the Justice Department, against the federal government. What do you make of that as a former federal prosecutor, and what power does Congress have to constrain this or preclude it from happening? Christina mentioned just a moment ago that the blowback the president has gotten from his party on the prospects of this Iran deal. I should say there was a lot of blowback from members of his own party about the creation of this fund as well.
Absolutely. I mean, frankly, I was shocked. I didn't really believe it at first, but, once it was confirmed, I was disgusted. And, former DOJ prosecutors, people who are still there, are shocked. And I think you're seeing that across the board, even with Senate and House Republicans. They just, it's just a shocking thing to do. And it looks like he was targeting the J6 defendants insurrectionists, actually, who had been convicted, I think over 1,500 of them. He pardoned all of them. That eliminated their requirement to pay restitution to the people that they hurt. And now he's going to say, okay, we're going to use $1.8 billion in American taxpayers' money to pay these guys and other, former convicted felons at the same time. It's disgusting. And the structure of the deal, with the IRS and the Department of Justice, both of whom serve at his pleasure, you didn't actually have any kind of objectivity in there. And the only to the extent you did, it was the judge. And she expressed real concern about the lack of objectivity and neutrality and adverse, parties in the scenario. But I think the politics of this are going to demand some kind of fix. I know there's a real effort to do something legislative. There's a couple options on the table. I'm not sure which one will play out, but I think at the end of the day, none of this money is going to be used to pay off people like that.
You're sure
and
that
this fund should be liquidated entirely.
That's because acting AG Todd Blanche did an interview with our colleague over at CNN and was asked, in the smaller realm, you know, the viability and legality and ethics of this fund aside.
Other than the play, Mrs. Lincoln.
Yeah. Other than the play, Mrs. How did you enjoy the play? Thanks, David. If it does go forward, is there a preclusion for giving money to people who assaulted police officers? And Blanche's response was, well, that'll have to be litigated or decided by this amorphous and defined committee members who are distributing this money. If you can't stop it, would you at least want to see something that precludes people who have been convicted of felonies or violent acts during January 6th or other incidents being disqualified?
Well, you know, certainly, but depending on who else they line up, and the names I've heard have just been a real rogues gallery. Michael Flynn, for example, you know, just names that have faded from public view, thankfully. And here they are again. Rudy Giuliani, folks like that. It's like, you know, please give me a break. But, you know, I think it's tax dollars that, you know, they keep saying, for example, he just said a little while ago, he didn't care about what's going on with the American public as far as, you know, the impact and their financial difficulties. We could use that $1.8 billion to do other things, like extend the healthcare tax credits, for example, or extend SNAP benefits, for example. But, you know, he's focused on paying off people who, you know, have really false claims against the United States and shouldn't be getting a dime. In fact, they should be paying the United States the restitution that they owe. So I think this is going to be defeated one way or the other. Might be a clawback. It might be a challenge to the structure of the this board or whatever, because it certainly wasn't established by Congress. I mean, what exactly is it? And you know, there's no authorization for the use of the funds from the appropriations committees either. So,
all right, Congressman, thank you so much. I'm afraid we're running out of time. Thank you for joining us. We really appreciate your perspective on a broad range of issues this morning.
Glenn Ivey joining us there. Coming up, we're going to turn our attention to Texas. That runoff election scheduled to take place on Tuesday. Our Julie Fine joins us next on Bloomberg TV.
Thank you for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's update you on today's top stories and a busy day in sports. Aside from the Indianapolis 500 kicking off, the first round of the 2026 French Open underway at Roland Garros in Paris. Now, Coco Gauff is looking to defend her title on the women's side. There's a guarantee to be a new men's champion because Carlos Alcaraz, he's stepping out due to a wrist injury, and that puts Jannik Sinner in the spotlight on the most famous clay court in the game. Also today, the PGA Tournament continues at TPC Craig Ranch in McKinney, Texas. Topping the leaderboard is Siwoo Kim at 21 under par. Tied for second is Scottie Scheffler and Wyndham Clark at 19 under par. In the NHL playoffs tonight, the Colorado Avalanche take on the Vegas Golden Knights, and the Golden Knights lead that series 2-0. And in the NBA, the Oklahoma City Thunder battle the San Antonio Spurs. OKC leads that series 2-1. The Knicks, they play tomorrow after beating the Cavaliers 121-108. They lead the series 3-0. But if you're not up for watching sports, you can always head to the movies. Yes, Deadline reporting that Disney's Star Wars, The Mandalorian and Grogu is heading for a $98 million four-day opening weekend with an additional $69 million internationally. Also out in theaters, Focus features Obsession and Lionsgate's Michael. I think I might do it for the Grogu.
Really?
Yes, I love. He's the cutest little thing.
With the baby Yoda.
My brother did force me to watch that show, and I did enjoy it, but I really just watched it for the cute little baby puppet thing.
That's it. All right. Well,
no Mandalorian for
that's
you?
my weekend.
Not your wheelhouse? See, this is how I feel when you guys talk about sports.
Oh, okay. All right.
Thanks, Lisa. President Trump has his sights set on installing MAGA candidates across the country ahead of the midterms. From Louisiana to Kentucky to Georgia, Republicans who have criticized the president have lost their primary races, giving Trump-backed candidates the Republican slots in November's midterms, and Trump touting his work.
MAGA is most of the Republican Party. The rhinos are gone to a large extent. A few of them are still left. We knocked out everybody. We were 38-0. 30. Think of that, 38-0. Who's 38-0? We haven't lost one in years. You want to know the truth?
Next up, Texas, where Trump endorsed Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton over incumbent Senator John Cornyn in the state's Senate primary. Joining us now is Bloomberg's Texas bureau chief. Live from Dallas this morning, Julie Fine, and political White House reporter Sophia Kai is with us as well. I believe her will be joining us shortly. Julie, let me start by asking about this astonishing $135 million figure. You've been living this on the ground in Texas, seeing the amount of money that's been poured into this Senate race. What does that look like on the ground, and how has this endorsement by the president at the 11th hour, how does it stand to kind of upend the work that John Cornyn has been trying to do here? He's known it's going to be a slog to this runoff. How's it complicated his path forward?
It's a complicated path forward for John Cornyn right now. This is a very expensive race, as you just spoke about, but most of it, of course, being spent on the Republican side. You know, there were questions whether the president would even endorse. He said he was going to do it immediately after the primary as the runoff began. There were a lot of reports it was going to go John Cornyn's way. However, that did not happen. So I mean, you turn on the television here, you turn on the radio here, there is an ad, there is something related to this race. And all this time, while the Republicans are really beating each other up, this gives James Tallarico time to just raise more and more money.
So that's what we've been talking about. It's not just that you always have this problem where you run to the right or to the left in a primary and then you've got to pivot for the general. They're now, you know, the president in a lot of these cases is bouncing the more moderate candidates who stood up to him on different issues, electing someone who's more MAGA and more to the right. So not only are you getting that infighting, but you're also spending money. Republicans are having to spend so much money in these primaries. Is that going to hurt them, especially in a general like this where Democrats have been able to hold back because they only have one candidate at the moment?
Well, there was a lot of concern from more moderate Republicans that if Ken Paxton became the nominee, they would have to sink a lot more money into Texas. That concern becomes more and more real for them. James Tallarico has really shown that he can raise a lot of money. However, I covered the race in 2018 between Beto O'Rourke and Ted Cruz. Beto O'Rourke greatly outraised Ted Cruz. That was over $100 million 6 years or almost 8 years ago. That really shows how much a Republican can do with fewer dollars.
Let's talk a bit about John Cornyn and how he fell out of the president's favor. We've all seen the post that he's pinned to his X profile of him reading the art of the deal. He made a lot of overtures to the president trying to secure this endorsement. Perhaps he thought he was going to get it. But Julie, walk us through where he has crossed the president of the United States. Why, when Donald Trump sat down at the Resolute desk, he decided, look, I'm going to throw my support behind Ken Paxton and not behind the incumbent senator?
Well, John Cornyn said years ago when President Trump was attempting to run again, he basically said, I don't know that he should be the candidate because I am not sure that he is electable in a general election. As you know, President Trump has a very, very long memory, obviously remembering that. Also, after the horrible shooting in Uvalde at the elementary school, John Cornyn was among the group that worked on a gun safety law for Mitch McConnell. So he's been part of the establishment. He was very close to Mitch McConnell for many years. He was spoken of as a possible candidate for majority leader before John Thune received that position.
When it comes to President Trump's endorsement, he waited, as we've been talking about, fairly late in this. Is that because, to your point, it wasn't really clear who was going? I mean, Paxton had the edge, but it wasn't huge. Was he waiting to see who would come out on top before he endorsed? And as these candidates then have to run in the general. You know, we saw the president last week go to Mike Lawler's district here in New York, which is usually a Democratic seat. It flipped to Republicans. Is there any kind of concern that the endorsement of President Trump could backfire again in the general, especially when you look at things like the war in Iran, the economy, and gas prices?
You know, Democrats have generally felt that it would be much easier to run against Ken Paxton than John Cornyn. It will be interesting to see in the next few months how that does go. But again, Democrats feel a little bit more confident running against Ken Paxton in that general election. Also, Ken Paxton has led in the polls recently. He's been up as much as 3 points, I believe. That may have had something to do also with the endorsement. You have to understand in the Texas primary here, it's a very interesting primary. If you vote in the Democratic primary, you cannot vote in the Republican runoff. If you vote in the Republican primary, you can vote in the Republican runoff. If you didn't vote at all, you can vote in the Republican runoff. Well, it'll be interesting to see how those numbers play out as well.
Julie, I don't know what the equivalent of the New York Post is in Texas. You can fill us in on that. But whatever tabloid is there has had a heyday with Ken Paxton's scandals, legal scandals, ethical scandals, digging into his messy divorce as well.
I covered his impeachment in 2023, and we were told the night before that he was going to lose the trial, and then all of a sudden it flipped, and he's quite a survivor.
Quite a survivor. A lot there. As you've listened to John Cornyn making his case, how much of it centers on that? The fact that all of this stuff doesn't even have to resurface, but it's going to be there front and center for James Talarico to pull from as we look ahead to the general election.
It will be there for James Talarico to pull from, but you have to remember this stuff has been here for years, and Ken Paxton continues to win. I mean, if you live in the state of Texas, it's not tabloids covering it. It's the Dallas Morning News. It's, it's regular publications, because these were adjudicated. They were in court. They were in the Texas legislature. So it'd be very difficult not to know about them until right now.
We do have some polling from the New York Times that says, if midterms were today, which party's candidate would you vote for? 50% Democratic, 39% Republican, 11% I don't know. How are Texans feeling, and where do you see this going?
Well, it'll be a very interesting race. You have to understand, though, that a Democrat has not won statewide here since the 90s. No matter who this person is, it's a difficult battle. It's an uphill battle, because you've got to move moderates in your direction. You have to move independents in your direction. By the way, the Republicans have spent a lot of time beating each other up. Now it's going to be the turn of the Democrat to really be in the attention span.
Julie, great to talk with you. Julie Fine there, our Texas bureau chief, joining us from Dallas on this Sunday morning. Thank you very much for that update ahead of that runoff on Tuesday. A fascinating piece in the New York Times today by David Goodman, kind of looking at the end of the Cornyn era in Texas politics, sort of what this means, a referendum on Republican politics in the state. And I think, Christina, that'll be the thing to watch here. Yes, who wins this runoff, but what it signals about the flavor of the Republican Party in Texas today and the future of it here in the years ahead.
100%. And great to talk to Julie, too,
Yes.
who covers all this and knows it inside and out. All right, coming up, are college grads souring on AI as they enter the workplace? It's even leading to protests on campus. Lisa Mateo dug into that, and we're going to dig into it as well next on Bloomberg This Weekend. Stay with us. We will be right back on all your various platforms.
Today, we stand on this edge of another technological transformation. It will touch every profession, every classroom, every hospital. I know what many of you are feeling about that. I can hear you. There is a fear.
He can hear you, so can we. That was former Google CEO Eric Schmidt getting booed during his commencement speech at the University of Arizona last week.
That's right. His comments about technology and how new graduates are being impacted by AI did not sit well with the audience.
As well.
My goodness.
Yeah, you can say that again, guys. So this is happening at college campuses across the country. Students, they're rebelling against AI. They're holding protests at Columbia University, Indianapolis, Central Florida, just to name a few. In a new Business Week article, it was featured in the Forecast newsletter, Joe Constance and Victor Sweezy, well, they write that the unique threat of artificial intelligence, what poses to students' education and their hopes of someday landing a job, has made the university a powerful crucible for anti-resistance. Well, I spoke with Joe earlier about it.
Some of the concerns are, it's very multifaceted. There's a lot of other things that students are worried about. I think there's the climate impact. That's something that this generation really cares about and is very concerned about. And so, they see news about data centers and how much energy those data centers take and what it really takes to power these systems. They're concerned about that. They're also concerned about things like, critical thinking. They go to college because they want to develop their critical thinking skills. And I think that they just see sometimes with their peers, if their peers are overusing chatbots, sometimes that means that they're outsourcing the work and the thinking to these tools in a way that they feel like isn't really helping them, and can honestly lead sometimes to a bit of a dependence on these tools. And so they don't like that. And then I think another kind of fierce source of opposition is worry about AI entering the arts and what that does to art and human creativity. So I think that Yes, the job market fears about displacement are certainly present, but there are a lot of other things that young people are concerned about.
Now, at the same time, you have companies that are looking for people who are AI savvy. So don't they need the skills too? Absolutely. That's what I've heard time and again from all of the executives that I talk to. They're looking for young people who know how to use these tools, use them effectively, and are excited about them and the potential that they bring. And they're really looking to, in many cases, to these young people to come in and shake up their organizations because they don't necessarily have preconceived notions of how the work should get done. And so they can come in, use AI, and find brand new ways of doing things. So executives are certainly looking for that. But it's interesting when I've been talking to college students and for the stories I'm writing about the job market, they are often deeply conflicted. Some of them say, I am using AI for my internships, but I don't know how to feel about it, or I'm not wild about it, but I feel like I have to because in order to get a job nowadays, this is what employers are looking for. Well, let's get into that sentiment because there's a Gallup poll out that kind of breaks it down a little bit more.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so this Gallup poll looked at Gen Z sentiment about AI in particular, and it found that even just from last year to this year, sentiment has deteriorated among this group. It's last year, almost 30% of Gen Z respondents said that they were hopeful about AI and the technology. And this spring, only about 18% said that they were hopeful. And there's rising anxiety, there's rising anger, in many cases because they see this technology becoming, it's no longer an option. It's something that they feel like they have to use either in the classroom or in order to get a job.
Yeah, and you talk about the classroom. I mean, there's also this whole thing around, using AI in the classroom and anti-plagiarism. I know when my daughter goes to college orientations, they lay out a whole, AI agenda and what's allowed, what's not allowed. It's changing there too.
It absolutely is. And I think what's difficult sometimes for students is that different professors will have different policies, and sometimes it's not consistent. And so it can be very difficult for a student who, cares very much about not plagiarizing, and following the rules. And so they are very hesitant to use AI in a lot of cases. And yet when they graduate, they're expected to be completely fluent and the most savvy AI user out there. So it can be difficult to understand how to navigate that.
How are colleges responding to a lot of these protests that are going on in some of the colleges?
I think that, in some cases they're setting up forums to talk to students to try to open up that channel of communication, because I think that in a lot of cases it's mostly coming from students feeling like they haven't been consulted in some of these decisions, they're not being heard. So there's some of that, but I think the main argument from universities is we would be doing students a grave disservice if we didn't include AI in our curriculums in some form or fashion, because this is what employers are looking for. This is where the direction companies are heading. And so, that's kind of how they're trying to adapt.
You can read more about this story and get a jump on your week ahead. Subscribe to the Forecast newsletter and Bloomberg.com. And a quick note, I've been doing the college orientations, open houses. That's all parents have questions about. AI. And that's all the colleges want to talk about. It's the top topic.
Love the anti-AI folk music outside the Columbia campus.
It's really fascinating.
Here we are.
So glad I didn't have to deal with this. Thank you so much, Lisa.
Thank you.
And thank you to all our colleagues all around the world, literally from South Africa to India, to the US, to London, who helped us this weekend. And thank you for joining us on Bloomberg This Weekend. Please join our colleagues in Asia this evening when global markets kick off trading at 7 p.m. Eastern. I'm Christina Ruffini.
I'm David Gura, along with Lisa Mateo. We'll be back with you Saturday at 7 o'clock Wall Street time. The Michelle Hussein Show is next right here on Bloomberg Television and Bloomberg Radio.